What if a line drawn in haste could split a civilization and still leave its people dreaming bigger than any border? This is the story of the Partition of 1947, how an empire stepped back, how Gandhi, Jinnah, and Nehru argued the future into being, and how millions of ordinary women and men carried history on their backs through stations, fields, rivers, and brand new capitals that smelled of fresh paint and fear. Tonight, we don't just revisit midnight speeches and maps with sharp edges. We walk the tracks of Punjab's ghost trains, drift along Bengal's shifting rivers, and step into camps where ration cards became survival and new nations learned to spell the word citizen. We sit in rooms where the Radcliffe Line was inked in weeks, watch ministries improvise law from chaos, and witness refugees turn loss into businesses, schools, and neighborhoods that still shape South Asia's skyline. You'll see how constitutions were forged to hold differences without breaking, how wars, from 1947 to Kargil, redrew doctrine but not resolve, how Bangladesh was born from courage in the face of horror, how seeds, canals, and steel remapped hunger, how cities grew from mills to malls, how women carried recovery on quiet shoulders, how rivers, heat, and the Sundarbans remind us nature doesn't read visas, and how music, cinema, cricket, and diaspora stitched a cultural commons across the line. This is not a tale of saints and villains. It's a handbook of consequences and choices. By the end, you'll recognize the real lesson. Strong states matter, plural citizenship matters, and speed without care can turn policy into pain. If that sounds like the past, it's also a message to our future. I'm your host on History Teller YT. Take a breath. Keep your mind open. Let's ride the night train of 1947 and watch how it still arrives every day in the lives we build now. In the beginning, the story of 1947 stretches far behind the famous photographs of flags being lowered and borders being drawn. It reaches back into the 18th century when the British East India Company began to master the art of ruling through revenue and trade. After the Battle of Plassey, 1757, and Buxar, 1764, the company secured the Diwani rights in Bengal, laying the fiscal foundations for a new kind of power, one that measured sovereignty in ledgers, not just in fortresses. The company's model relied on intermediaries, zamindars who squeezed rent, courtiers who translated decree into practice, and soldiers who learned that discipline could be a currency. When the 1857 revolt shook this edifice, the British Crown replaced the company, promising reform while tightening control. Railways, telegraphs, and canals became the hardware of modernity, yet they also allowed the state to surveil and extract with unprecedented reach. The legal code reshaped relationships. Personal laws, criminal statutes, and courts drew lines across communal and caste identities. Crucially, representation entered the colonial vocabulary. Councils, acts, and commissions were designed to consult without ceding authority. The colonial state thus produced a paradox. It unified a subcontinent under a bureaucratic roof while classifying its inhabitants in finely grained categories. Census operations turned fluid communities into counted communities, fixing identities into tables. Economic shocks, from global depressions to wartime requisitions, made provinces interdependent and fragile. This is how empire made India a governable unit, but simultaneously taught its subjects to see themselves through enumerated difference. The Partition of 1947 would later feed on these habits. The language of rights filtered through categories, the geography of provinces mapped onto revenue histories, and the grammar of politics set by councils and reforms. In short, by the late 19th century, the stage was ready. A modern state existed, but it was an alien one, balancing the promise of reform against the refusal to share real power. That tension bred both the dream of national freedom and the fear that freedom might arrive as someone else's dominance. As the 20th century dawned, Britain experimented with constitutional engineering to manage agitation without surrendering control. The Indian Councils Act of 1909, Morley, Minto, expanded legislative councils and introduced separate electorates for Muslims, a device intended to reassure elites that they would not be swamped in majoritarian politics. The measure was framed as a safeguard, but it institutionalized a powerful precedent. Political representation could be apportioned along communal lines. A few years later, the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms, 1919, inaugurated diarchy, dividing provincial subjects into transferred and reserved domains, while keeping the levers of coercion, finance, and emergency powers in imperial hands. Elections arrived, but with limited franchises and structured incentives for communal bargaining. These reforms taught Indian politicians the vocabulary of ministries, budgets, and coalition arithmetic, yet they also solidified the colonial habit of thinking that stability required balancing communities rather than cultivating a common demos. Outside councils, mass politics blossomed. The press circulated speeches across distances, and voluntary associations multiplied. But the constitutional pathway convinced many elites that the price of participation was communal arithmetic. The logic sharpened during crises. After World War I, with economic dislocation and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, trust collapsed, yet the machinery of separate representation remained. In this crucible, ideas hardened into platforms. The Congress advanced the claim of a broader Indian nation, while Muslim leaders warned that numerical majorities could become permanent, potentially threatening religious and cultural autonomy. The British, for their part, saw in separate electorates a convenient wedge, both a promise to minorities and a lever to fragment unified opposition. By the 1930s, the political class had grown used to constitutions as iterative bargains, not social contracts. Each round of reform, Simon Commission debates, round table conferences, the Government of India Act of 1935 deepened electoral routines while postponing the central question: who ultimately governed whom? The result was a constitutional tunnel without an exit sign, a system that schooled politicians to count communities even as masses learned to count votes. Beneath constitutional chiseling, a cultural revolution unfolded. Print capitalism spread vernacular newspapers and novels, knitting together readers who would never meet, yet would come to imagine themselves as part of a community. Reform movements, Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, Aligarh, Deoband, debated scripture, science, and social custom, reinterpreting faith in the idioms of modernity. In Bengal, Maharashtra, Punjab, and beyond, language associations formed, producing grammars for identity. School curricula and literary canons connected emotion with collective memory. The Aligarh movement, spearheaded by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, advocated modern education as the pathway for Indian Muslims to thrive under new conditions. Others feared that secular nationalism would dilute religious civilization. Meanwhile, economic life changed rapidly. Railway towns, port cities, and industrial belts created new classes: clerks, teachers, mill hands, each bearing aspirations that politics would soon mobilize. This ferment birthed new leaders. Gandhi returned from South Africa with the tools of mass non-cooperation. Nehru envisioned a secular republic inspired by socialist planning. Jinnah, trained in law and negotiation, believed in constitutionalism and rights. Each carried a different answer to the same riddle. How could a civilization as plural as the subcontinent become a legitimate state? For many, The answer lay in a composite nationalism, where religious communities flourished within a common civic frame. For others, especially amid anxieties of demographic weight and regional dominance, safety required political boundaries that acknowledged civilizational difference. The colonial state's habits, census categories, separate electorates, did not cause these ideas, but they provided rails on which they ran. By the 1930s, identities had become political strategies, and strategies had become identities. The partition was not predestined, but the tracks on which it would arrive were already being laid, sleeper by sleeper, across provinces and through hearts. Mahatma Gandhi's arrival on the national stage changed not only tactics, but the very moral grammar of Indian politics. He reframed resistance as satyagraha, holding fast to truth, where the means were as sacred as the ends. The non-cooperation movement, 1920 to 22, mobilized millions to boycott foreign cloth, law courts, and schools, converting daily habits into political instruments. For the first time, peasants in distant districts and merchants in bustling bazaars felt their fingers on the lever of history. Yet mass politics is a double-edged tool. It concentrates moral energy while dispersing control. The Chauri Chaura incident, where a violent clash led to the burning of a police station, prompted Gandhi to suspend the movement, stunning supporters who believed the moment ripe for escalation. This decision revealed a lasting tension. Gandhi's insistence on nonviolence, as both principle and strategy, often collided with the impatience of a populace living under economic strain. It also opened space for alternative visions. Revolutionaries who distrusted constitutionalism, socialists who saw class as the organizing axis, and communal leaders who suspected that composite nationalism would translate into demographic submergence. Gandhi's brilliance lay in his ability to translate spirituality into civic discipline, but his method required an almost impossible synchronization of mass feeling. When synchronized, it created miracles, cleaning villages, spinning khadi, bridging caste lines and shared purpose. When it slipped, politics spilled into improvisation. British administrators alternately underestimated and overreacted, passing repressive laws that fueled further mobilization. Through this decade, Gandhi taught Indians to imagine freedom as a daily practice and taught the world that empire could be challenged without armies. But the question of representation, how communities would share power, remained a riddle, deferred by shared sacrifice, yet lurking in provincial elections and local councils, waiting to return with sharper edges. The Salt March of 1930 distilled Gandhi's genius for converting moral intuition into political theater. Salt, common, universal, essential, was taxed by the colonial state. To make it by hand became an act of sovereignty. Gandhi's trek from Sabarmati to Dandi was meticulously ordinary and thus electrifying. An elderly man walking, praying, writing letters, drawing crowds who grasped that liberty could live in the granules of life. International press turned the march into a global parable, and arrests only multiplied its resonance. This moment bridged classes, lawyers risking briefs, women stepping into public leadership, peasants blending their grievances with national idioms. Yet while SALT unified, provincial politics differentiated. The Government of India Act, 1935, expanded provincial autonomy and set the stage for 1937 elections. Congress formed ministries in several provinces, demonstrating administrative competence while provoking anxieties among those outside its umbrella. Muslim League leaders who feared a permanent Congress Raj, regional parties wary of centralizing tendencies. The salt of unity, thus, sat beside the spice of competition. Gandhi, who abhorred communal division, believed that trust could be built through ethical politics and social reform. But governing demanded choices: language of instruction, appointment quotas, temple entry, agrarian legislation, each choice sending ripples through layered identities. The salt that bound could also sting. In that sting, rivals organized. The British, watching, calculated that devolving power without surrendering the center would both satisfy aspirations and maintain imperial leverage. Meanwhile, the world lurched toward war, and with it came new bargains and broken promises. The spectacle of defiance had shown the capacity for mass unity. The hard arithmetic of ministries would test whether that unity could survive the daily grind of governance. World War II placed India at the epicenter of competing imperatives: imperial survival, Axis threat, famine, and the accelerating demand for unequivocal independence. The British declared India at war without consulting Indian leaders. The Congress ministries resigned in protest, while the Muslim League, sensing opportunity, expanded its organizational reach, presenting itself as a guardian of Muslim interests in a volatile time. The Crips Mission, 1942, offered dominion status after the war, with provinces free to opt out. Congress saw this as a balkanizing trap. The League saw room to negotiate, and Gandhi judged the offer insufficient. Quit India exploded as a call for immediate British withdrawal. The state responded with mass arrests. Leadership went underground. Communications were severed, and the movement, decentralized, sometimes turned violent despite Gandhi's creed. The war brought devastation. Bengal's 1943 famine exposed administrative failure and market cruelty, leaving searing memories in the very province that would later be sliced. Quit India demonstrated the depth of anti-imperial resolve, but also revealed a political impasse. The British would not transfer power to a single center without guarantees, and the main Indian parties would not accept arrangements that emasculated the future state. The immediacy of the Quit India demand, morally compelling, collided with the brittleness of wartime governance and the strategic calculations of all actors. As the war neared its end, the chessboard reset. The British were exhausted, their legitimacy eroded. Congress leaders emerged from prison determined, yet divided on tactics. The Muslim League, strengthened organizationally, pressed its claim for a separate homeland. Gandhi's wager, that moral insistence could bend imperial will without fracturing the domestic compact, had forced the first half of that equation. The second half, preventing fracture, would now be tested in negotiations where time was short, tempers were long, and tragedy lurked in the margins. Muhammad Ali Jinnah began as a constitutional nationalist, admired for his eloquence and his belief in legal pathways to self-rule. He defended minority rights within a unified India, famously mediating between factions and advocating compromise. But the logic of separate electorates, the experiences of provincial ministries, and the arithmetic of demographics pushed him toward a stark conclusion. In a majoritarian democracy, minorities risk permanent subordination, and rights on paper may fail in practice. The Lahore Resolution of 1940 crystallized this shift, calling for independent states in the Muslim-majority areas. Interpreters argued about singular versus plural Pakistan, but the politics were unmistakable. Muslim nationhood required constitutional expression not reducible to minority safeguards. Jinnah's strategy balanced legalism and mass mobilization. He built the League into a disciplined machine, courting landlords and urban elites, but also expanding into towns and campuses with a message of dignity and destiny. His rhetoric was cool, even austere, but it spoke to fears that nationalist unity might translate into cultural dilution and political eclipse. Jinnah's critics saw opportunism. His supporters saw realism. The British, calculating exit strategies, recognized that the League's veto mattered. The Congress, confident in its mass base, struggled to see the League as co-equal. Gandhi preferred a moral compact, Nehru a modern republic, while provincial leaders navigated their own constituencies. In this mix, the idea of Pakistan became both bargaining chip and belief system. It promised a state where Muslim identity would not require apology, where constitutional design would reflect a different civilizational starting point. Whether this would produce a liberal democracy or a communal mirror image remained contested. What mattered in 1940 to 45 was that the demand matured from elite formula to mass slogan, acquiring momentum that negotiations could not ignore. The 1946 provincial elections transformed political abstractions into popular mandates. The Muslim League won an overwhelming share of Muslim seats, even in regions where Congress had once seemed impregnable. This result did not mean that every Muslim voter envisioned the same Pakistan. Rural patronage, local grievances, and campaign theater all mattered. But as a political fact, the mandate made Pakistan a force that could not be rhetorically wished away. The Congress triumphed in general constituencies, confirming its dominance among many Hindus and across regions. Two parallel popular sovereignties had thus been articulated, and the British, now eager to depart, recognized that a constitutional handshake would require both signatories. The Cabinet Mission Plan attempted precisely this handshake, a weak center for defense, foreign affairs, and communications, powerful groups of provinces with autonomy, and a constituent assembly assembled through grouped voting. For a moment, it seemed workable. Jinnah saw in it a pathway to parity without partition. Congress feared that grouping would entrench communal vetoes and fetter a national state. Nehru's famous press conference remarks suggested that Congress would enter the assembly free to alter arrangements. Jinnah, sensing a bait-and-switch, recoiled. Direct Action Day, August 1946, in Calcutta, intended as a demonstration of resolve, collapsed into horrific communal violence. The idea descended from speeches in the streets, from pamphlets in the neighborhoods. The plebeianization of the Pakistan demand was thus completed in the worst possible way, through blood. Yet this new reality also hardened the leadership positions. The British, counting the cost of garrisons and administration, accelerated their timeline. Elections had legitimized leaders. Violence had delegitimized coexistence in many minds. And the window for a federative compact narrowed to a slit. Lord Louis Mountbatten arrived in 1947 with a brief to end the British Raj quickly and with a reputation for daring timelines. He concluded that compromise models had failed and that only a binary decision, one state or two, could prevent indefinite chaos. His plan moved astonishingly fast. Release of political prisoners, intense one-on-ones with Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, and Jinnah, and a push to set a firm transfer date. Speed became strategy. Jinnah, convinced that parity within one India had become illusory, accepted partition. Congress leaders, haunted by the specter of a maimed federation paralyzed by communal vetoes, reluctantly preferred partition to a center that could be endlessly blackmailed by provincial groupings. Gandhi stood nearly alone, pleading for unity and even floating the idea of Jinnah as prime minister. But his moral imagination could not override political arithmetic and public fear. Provincial leaders in Punjab and Bengal battled with impossible choices, whether to divide their historic homelands or attempt last-minute coalitions. The machinery of partition was set in motion. New dominions to be created, assets to be divided, services to be split, and, fatally, boundaries to be drawn. Mountbatten's speed reduced opportunity for mischief among spoilers, but also ensured that mapping would outrun ground truth. The binary choice brought clarity at the top and confusion below. In the weeks that followed, clarity would turn to catastrophe along roads, rails, and rivers. The choice for two states became, for millions, a forced choice of movement, faith, and survival, a test of what it meant to belong in a land where belonging had just been given new borders. Enter Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never set foot in India, tasked with chairing two boundary commissions, Punjab and Bengal, to draw lines dividing provinces that had evolved over centuries. He was given scarce weeks, patchy maps, and political submissions brimming with selective statistics. The commissions considered three principal criteria: contiguous majorities, administrative practicality, and other factors that became a black box for strategic and humanitarian concerns. In Punjab, Sikhs' sacred geography overlapped with Muslim demographic majorities. Canal colonies and rail lines tied regions together that politics now demand to be severed. In Bengal, the riverine ecology made borders fluid. Jute, rice, and trade routes ignored sectarian arithmetic. Radcliffe's award, delivered in mid-August but kept secret until after independence ceremonies, attempted to split the difference, literally. The result: Gurdaspur Tahsil controversies, the fate of Calcutta secured for India, the slicing of districts where village-to-village identities shifted like currents. Boundaries that might have functioned if prepared over years were instead invoked overnight. Maps became weapons and talismans. Rumors raced ahead of official notices. The Commission's reliance on district-level data often masked micro-majorities. A line through a field could turn a family's ancestral land into a foreign country. Administrators who might have supervised orderly transitions were themselves packing to cross. The Radcliffe moment is infamous not only for its haste, but for its logic, a cartographic solution to a civilizational disagreement. A map can capture where people live. It cannot capture how they live, whom they marry, where they worship, or which market they depend on. In a gap between line and life, tragedy found room to operate. Yet even here, one must note the intent: to minimize conflict through clarity. The paradox is that clarity at scale produced chaos at the human level. What looked neat in London's files bled on Punjab's trains and Bengal's riverbanks. Migration as catastrophe. Trains, caravans, and the geography of fear. The months around August 1947 witnessed one of the largest and most rapid population movements in modern history. In Punjab, entire caravans, tens of thousands strong, trudged westward or eastward under a pitiless sun. Trains, symbols of industrial progress, became both lifelines and slaughterhouses. Stories abounded of ghost trains arriving at stations with only corpses aboard, rumors amplifying terror until rumor itself killed. In Bengal, the movement was more prolonged and cyclical, with Hindus filtering into Calcutta and beyond, while Muslims moved eastward into what would become East Pakistan. The violence was not uniform. It varied by district, by the presence or absence of disciplined forces, by whether local leaders chose protection or predation. Yet certain features recurred. Abductions and assaults targeted women as bearers of communal honor. Property seizures endowed violence with profit. Retaliatory logic spiraled as each atrocity justified the next. The state, freshly born, struggled to perform its most basic function: monopoly over force. Police units split, army regiments were reallocated, and civil services were decimated by resignations and transfers. Relief camps sprung up, improvising shelter out of canvas and hope. Humanitarian responses wrestled with questions that had no good answers. How to verify identity for those without documents. How to reunite families when names were shared and spellings contested. how to repatriate abducted women when communities stigmatize their return. Migration, in this moment, was not merely movement. It was a ritual of unmaking and remaking. People bartered jewelry for a seat on a lorry. They memorized new addresses as if memorizing a new self. The geography of fear redrew social maps long after the boundary lines hardened, leaving enclaves, exodus towns, and border bazaars as fossils of the cataclysm. The partition did not end when feet stopped moving. It continued in the nightmares that followed. Administrative partition, splitting armies, ledgers, and futures. Behind the spectacle of crowds lay the quieter, equally monumental task of dividing a state. Armies were apportioned, regiments reassigned by class composition and recruitment zones, with equipment inventories counted down to rifles and tents. The Indian civil service, once the steel frame of the Raj, was split. Files were boxed and sent along new corridors of sovereignty. Currency reserves, debt obligations, and the portfolio of public works were haggled over like the spoils of an unwanted divorce. Even the post and telegraph had to be bifurcated. Stamps crossed borders, overprinted, or rendered unusable. At the ports, customs regimes were born overnight. At airfields, control towers now spoke different protocols. Universities debated affiliations. Syllabi were rewritten to reflect new civics. Legal continuities were declared to keep courts functioning. This administrative partition had two faces. On one side, it displayed remarkable resilience. Trains ran again, ministries opened, troops deployed, budgets passed. On the other, it entrenched a narrative of separation at the level of everyday bureaucracy. A new recruit entering service in Delhi or Karachi learned not only a new anthem, but also a new mental map of allies and threats. The very success of administrative division made reconciliation harder, because routine is a powerful teacher. After a few years of separate routines, unity becomes a counterfactual rather than a memory. And yet, within these new structures, people built lives. Lawyers argued, teachers taught, farmers sowed. The future was written by clerks as much as by charismatic leaders. The files they stamped, refugee property claims, compensation bonds, exchange permits, became the documentary backbone of new nations. The tragedy of partition thus had an archival afterlife. The ledger as a ledger of loss. The seal as a seal on memory. Two midnights, celebration, shock, and a state-born emotion. At the stroke of midnight on August 15th, 1947 in Delhi, and a day earlier in Karachi, because the new dominions marked different legal births, ceremonies and bonfires try to fix a story of triumph. Nehru's oratory in the Constituent Assembly set a horizon of justice and dignity. Mountbatten's meticulously staged transfer offered a visual grammar of continuity. Flags rose, badges changed, and a billion gestures tried to learn a new etiquette of sovereignty. Yet even as fireworks lit the night, the ground was moving. Governments were born while their jurisdictions were still being defined. Police lines were redrawn while trains full of frightened families were already on the rails. Speeches about unity competed with bulletins about killings in the markets of Amritsar and Lahore. In both dominions, the state entered life mid-stride. Ministries staffed by exhausted men and women worked from rooms still smelling of fresh paint. Teleprinters chattered with conflicting orders, and brand new cabinets discovered that the first task of freedom was triage. The principles the leaders had articulated, secular citizenship in India, a Muslim homeland in Pakistan, were forced to speak quickly to emergencies that cared little for constitutional phrasing, where to position troops when tracks were sabotaged, how to steer ration trucks through neighborhoods that distrusted the uniform delivering them, whether to impose curfews that might save lives but also signal impotence. The symbolism of independence collided with the materiality of bodies in motion. Refugees arrived with bundles and rumors. Rumor, in turn, traveled faster than any communique, painting the next district in the colors of fear. In Delhi, joy and dread overlapped. Processions of school children shared streets with processions of the dispossessed. In Karachi, a city of migrants even before 1947, office buildings filled with new cadres while docks groaned under the cargo of an improvised state. To be free in that August meant improvising legitimacy on a moving platform, finding a way to speak as a government to citizens who were not yet sure where here ended and there began, or even which pronoun contained them. Independence, in effect, began as motion. The map was the promise, and the road was the reality. Punjab's firestorm, trains, militias, and the collapse of neighborhood compacts. Nowhere did the promise and the road diverge more violently than the Punjab. The granary and Marshall Reservoir of the Raj, now cut by a line that ran through canals, recruitment belts, and sacred geographies. Pre-partition, Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims had lived not in simple majority-minority mosaics, but in nested compacts. A Sikh village dependent on a Muslim market town, a Hindu moneylender financing a Muslim canal settler, a Muslim artisan making the implements for a Sikh agrarian festival. When panic entered these compacts, it weaponized intimate knowledge. Who owned cattle, which route a marriage procession would take, where the weak parts of a settlement lay. The Punjab Boundary Force, assembled as a neutral umbrella for the transition, proved hopelessly small and uncertain of orders. Militias filled the vacuum. On the eastern side, Sikh Jathas, some mobilized through networks that had once organized religious reform and community welfare, armed with local intelligence and a rhetoric of historic wrongs, moved to clear routes and avenge atrocities real and rumored. On the western side, Muslim League National Guards and local Lashkars coalesced, sometimes with the connivance of officials who had already mentally crossed the line. Those who wished to protect were often outnumbered and outgunned. Those who wavered learned that hesitation, too, could be fatal. Trains, the pride of colonial infrastructure, became theaters of both mercy and massacre. Schedules that once guaranteed reliability now guaranteed predictability. Attackers knew when a refugee special would pass the culvert where embankments narrowed. Rescuers learned to flag down locomotives with bed sheets and torches. Stories of ghost trains, carriages arriving with doors sealed and passengers slaughtered, spread like a toxin, converting every platform into an index of dread. Villages negotiated absurd armistices for a night, only to see them shattered by dawn when a different band arrived. The speed of partition's timetable ensured that preventive administration lagged behind retaliatory imagination. And yet, in the inferno, acts of courage persisted. Farmers hiding neighbors in haystacks, station masters lined to mobs, priests and Malvis opening shrines and mosques as sanctuaries. These stories did not cancel the arithmetic of death, but they preserved the moral remainder of a region that refused, in every instance, to become only a statistic of hate. Bengal's long partition, river routes, urban refuge, and the seeds of a language nation. Bengal's partition was cut by river, memory, and a different cadence of fear. Having already endured the great Calcutta killings in August 1946 and the retaliatory pogroms in Bihar later that year, Eastern districts entered 1947 with nerves frayed and political tempers primed. The Radcliffe Line, while decisive on maps, encountered the amphibious logic of the Delta. A border that tried to run along rivers had to live with rivers that refused to stay still. In many places, violence erupted, especially in Khulna, Jessore, Noakhali's aftershocks, and in pockets along the Nadia-Kushti axis. But the movement of people tended to be more staggered than the huge caravans of Punjab. Hindus left East Bengal in waves, some immediately, others after testing the new dispensation through a harvest or a school term, often finding refuge in Calcutta slums that turned into long-term neighborhoods. Muslims who feared insecurity in the West moved toward Khulna, Barisal, and Dhaka, and into the promise of a state that called them insiders. Urban politics absorbed these flows. Calcutta's municipal system strained and then hardened around refugee needs. Dhaka learned to speak as a capital not only to its hinterland, but also to migrants who expected employment and inclusion. The economic fabric of jute, the golden fiber that linked East Bengal's fields to mills in West Bengal, showed how partition could shatter and reassemble supply chains. New licensing regimes, smuggling corridors, and substitute markets rewrote the commerce of the Delta. And beneath these adjustments, a different current gathered force. The sense that Pakistan's eastern wing, overwhelmingly Bengali in language and culture, did not wish to trade one distant center for another. The 1948 state language controversy, culminating in a 1952 language movement, was prefigured in 1947 by the quiet insistence that identity in the East could not be flattened into a single religious denominator. Bengal's partition, therefore, was longer in time and richer in contradiction. It produced grievous violence, yet not the same simultaneity of annihilation seen in Punjab. It generated refugeehood as a durable urban condition. It planted the question that would one day unmake the eastern wing of Pakistan. What, finally, binds a nation? Creed, tongue, or the stubborn geography of everyday life? Lapse of paramountcy, Patel's statecraft, and the instruments of accession. When the British withdrew, sovereignty did not simply divide in two. It also splintered across more than 560 princely states. Polities that had been bound to the Raj by treaties and tribute rather than by direct administration. With paramountcy lapsed, each prince theoretically regained full independence, but the geography of railways, rivers, and revenue made such independence a fantasy. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, India's new Home Minister, and his civil service strategist V.P. Menon devised an elegant, ruthless solution, the instrument of accession. Princes would retain internal autonomy, but cede to the dominion of India authority over defense, external affairs, and communications, the skeleton of sovereignty, while integration councils and privy purses sweetened the bargain. The method combined persuasion with calibrated pressure. Menon's flights from capital to capital, bearing drafts and deadlines, created a theater of inevitability. Patel's reputation for resolve ensured that delay looked less like bargaining and more like self-harm. Most rulers, facing the practicalities of currency, trade, and protection, signed. A few tried to chart other courses. Travancore flirted with an independent maritime identity anchored in mineral wealth. Bhopal weighed its cultural affinities, and the Nizam of Hyderabad imagined a sovereign Muslim-ruled heart in a largely Hindu interior. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and his colleagues pursued accessions that would secure corridors, ports, or bargaining counters. The accession drama, therefore, was not a tidy legal exercise. It was a competitive mapping of the future. Crucially, the policy framed integration as continuity rather than conquest, arguing that the Raja's paramount functions must belong to a successor state to avoid anarchy. That argument spoke to administrators and bankers as much as to soldiers. Junagadh and Hyderabad, plebiscite, police action, and the ethics of force. Junagadh, a small Kathiawar state with a Muslim ruler and a large Hindu population. startled observers by acceding to Pakistan in September 1947, despite the absence of territorial contiguity and the economic pull of Saurashtra toward Bombay and Ahmedabad. The decision tested every premise of orderly partition. India responded with a repertoire that mixed blockade, administrative encirclement, and the promise of a referendum. As law and order frayed and the Nawab fled, a provisional government aligned with India formed. The subsequent plebiscite in February 1948 returned an overwhelming vote for accession to India. Pakistan denounced the process as coercive. India presented it as democratic ratification. The episode established a precedent. Where rulers and peoples diverged, people would be invoked, but only when the strategic ledger permitted. In Hyderabad, divergence ran in the other direction. The Nizam presided over a wealthy, sprawling state surrounded by Indian territory, seeking a standstill agreement to buy time, while the Razakar militia under Qasim Razvi radicalized the streets. Communal and agrarian conflicts fused. Violence in border districts bled into the Deccan interior, and Delhi judged that the enclave threatened both security and credibility. In September 1948, India launched Operation Polo, a brief police action that overran Hyderabad within days. Reports of atrocities, reprisals, and mass detentions followed, later parsed by committees and historians with differing conclusions but unanimous sorrow. For Pakistan, Hyderabad underlined accusations that India sanctified force when convenient. For India, it cemented the narrative that the Republic could not tolerate a hostile sovereign wedge in its torso. These twin cases illuminate the ethics of early post-colonial force. Each dominion spoke the language of legality and popular will. Each chose, at times, the instrument of compulsion. Nation building, in this moment, was not the opposite of coercion. It was an argument about when coercion preserved the possibility of nationhood and when it poisoned it. Kashmir, invasion, accession, and the ceasefire line that became a future. Kashmir was the fuse that, once lit, cast a long, flickering light over South Asia's next 7 decades. A Himalayan principality with a Hindu ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, and a majority Muslim populace, it sat at the hinge of rivers and routes that mattered to both new states. In August 1947, the Maharaja sought to wait, signing a standstill agreement with Pakistan and letting time crystallize options. Events outran him. In October, tribal militias from Pakistan's northwest frontier, backed by elements in Pakistan who believed a plebiscite would anyway deliver the valley, poured into Kashmir, seizing towns and terrifying residents with a mix of plunder, zeal, and rumor. As raiders neared Srinagar, the Maharaja appealed to Delhi. India's leaders, after fevered consultations, insisted that military help required a legal basis. The Maharaja signed the instrument of accession on October 26, 1947. The next morning, Indian troops airlifted into Srinagar in a display of speed that became foundational lore for the new army. The war that followed was brutal and improvised. Mountain skirmishes at passes with names that would become schoolbook lines. Winter logistics pushed to the edge. Local militias fighting for homes they could not afford to lose. Pakistan framed the conflict as a thwarted right of self-determination. India framed it as defense against aggression subsequent to a valid accession and promised that once order was restored, the will of the people would be consulted. In early 1948, India took the dispute to the United Nations. Resolutions called for a ceasefire, withdrawal of Pakistani forces and irregulars, reduction of Indian troop levels, and a plebiscite under international auspices, steps that each side interpreted through strategic lenses. By January 1949, a ceasefire line crystallized, later the line of control. leaving Pakistan in possession of roughly a third of the former state and India the rest, including the densely populated valley. The human ledger included massacres in Jammu's districts, the scattering of communities, and the planting of cemeteries that still teach their stone lessons. Kashmir reconfigured security doctrines, budget priorities, and political imaginations in both countries. It also revealed a tragic constant of partition's afterlife, that arguments begun as constitutional disputes could harden into cartographies of sentiment, where the map in a child's atlas and the memories at a widow's hearth each demanded borders the other could not accept. In that contradiction, South Asia's future found one of its most durable and sorrowful frontiers. Camps, cards, and the state's first social contract after freedom. Refugees did not simply arrive. They forced the newborn states to improvise social contracts in real time. In India, the government created a lattice of reception, transit, and permanent camps, each with its own rituals of enumeration. Registration desks where names were misheard and misspelled, ration cards that turned survival into an inked rectangle, medical tents where vaccinations and grief stood in adjacent queues. Delhi's Purana Kila became a city within the city, echoing with announcements about train departures and lost children. In Punjab, the Rehabilitation Finance Administration and a web of provincial boards tried to translate abandoned houses and fields into compensation bonds, tallying verified claims against a ledger of properties that were now across a hostile border. In the east, West Bengal's government navigated a refugee influx that arrived in pulses, not a single tsunami. People tested conditions in East Pakistan, then moved after a riot or a job loss, returned briefly for a wedding or harvest, and came back again to Calcutta's busties and the railway towns that became semi-permanent. Pakistan faced reciprocal urgencies. Karachi's population ballooned as Muhajirs from UP, CP, and beyond poured in with briefcases of degrees and suitcases of Urdu books. In West Punjab, evacuee property became the raw material for a new urban class. And in East Pakistan, the state juggled land settlement with agrarian realities in districts where Hindu zamindars fled, but cultivators remained. Relief was never only humanitarian, it was administrative pedagogy. Citizens learned what these states could and could not do. They learned that a file could be a lifeline, that an official letter could unlock a plot of land or a small loan, that clerical error could erase a family's pre-partition wealth. They learned, too, that politics could enter the tent, party workers advocating for their refugees, clerics mediating camp quarrels, journalists amplifying scandal and success. In the process, the very idea of citizenship thickened. It became less an abstract promise and more a practice performed at counters and camp kitchens. The trauma of dislocation thus seeded an infrastructure of welfare and surveillance that would shape governance long beyond the last tent being folded, bringing with them administrative cultures and literary associations that reshaped urban life. But property on the move also meant memory on the move. The room where a child was born became someone else's storeroom. A courtyard that hosted Eid prayers became a Durga Puja pandal. A mango grove changed from ours to theirs through a stamp and a key. The legal act of custody could not domesticate the moral sensation that certain losses are not compensable. And yet, with every contested key handover, a new city block, bazaar lane, or village ward found its next story. Grain, jute, and steel, rebuilding circulation after the circuit shattered. Partition was also an industrial and agrarian shock. The Raj had integrated regions around commodities that ignored religion. Punjab's wheat, Bengal's jute, Bihar's coal and iron, Bombay's textiles, Sindh's rice, United Province's sugar, each moving along a logistics grid calibrated to imperial and global markets. The new border slashed these circuits, turning yesterday's routine into today's customs problem. India lost much of the jute growing area to East Pakistan, but retained the major mills around Calcutta. Pakistan kept the raw fiber, but lacked processing capacity. This mismatch catalyzed smuggling, barter, and bilateral negotiations that oscillated between pragmatism and principle. In the West, canal colonies that had fed the Rajas' wartime needs now had to feed a larger Pakistan, while supply chains for fertilizers, machine parts, and credit were being reassembled. India, facing refugee pressure and the memory of famine, doubled down on rationing systems and public distribution, learning to choreograph procurement and movement from surplus to deficit districts while planning new dams and canals. Bakra, Nungal would soon become a symbol of technocratic nationhood. Steel became the emblem of self-reliance for both states. India expanded on Jamshedpur's legacy and plotted new plants with Soviet and Western assistance. Pakistan, starting with fewer heavy industry assets, leaned on trading cities and agrarian exports while gesturing at future industrialization. Currency and banking had to be disentangled as well. Reserve bank arrangements unwound. New central banks flexed novice muscles, and capital controls tried to stabilize volatile exchange. Meanwhile, ports changed their hinterlands. Bombay turned inland more assertively. Karachi claimed West Punjab as its natural partner in Dremuk water. Calcutta struggled but adapted around a different map of supply. These material rewrites fed political imaginations. 5-year plans in India promised that engineering could cure fracture, that a state could be stitched with concrete and kilowatts. In Pakistan, the rhetoric of development merged with the legitimacy of a Muslim homeland, arguing that prosperity would validate the new map. In both stories, the economy was not merely an engine. It was therapy, an attempt to persuade millions that tomorrow's jobs and grain would be worth yesterday's terrible price. Writing a republic, the Indian Constituent Assembly, and the invention of the center. If partition tore, constitution-making tried to weave. India's Constituent Assembly, convened before independence, but absorbing its shock, labored through committees and midnight debates to design a state that could be both strong and plural. The drafting committee under B.R. Ambedkar distilled a mountain of proposals into a document that married parliamentary government to a muscular center, partly as a lesson of partition. Weak federalism, many argued, had nearly derailed unity in 1946. Fundamental rights promised speech, faith, association, and equality before law. Directive principles sketched a horizon of social democracy. Emergency provisions acknowledged the unruly world into which the Republic was born. The Assembly wrestled with language, representation, and reservations, understanding that a caste-ridden society would not turn egalitarian by eloquence alone. It borrowed widely. Due process ideas from America, parliamentary conventions from Britain, federal devices from Canada, judicial review and rights remedies from multiple sources, yet claimed an indigenous legitimacy through exhaustive deliberation and public scrutiny. The Constitution that came into effect on January 26, 1950, was both a text and a training manual. It taught citizens to petition courts, taught administrators to justify discretion, taught politicians to count majorities within rules rather than on streets. Critics on the left saw it as too lawyerly, on the right as too secular, and in the regions as too centralizing. But its very capaciousness allowed amendment and adaptation. Linguistic reorganization of states in 1956 answered a long agitation, and later expansions of franchise practice deepened the democratic habit. Behind the clauses stood the memory of 1947, a resolve to prevent balkanization without flattening diversity, to make belonging civic rather than communal, and to bind the security state within legal fences. The Constitution was thus not only a legal shield. It was a moral bet that procedure could domesticate passion, that a nation could be argued into coherence, and then, through routine, loved. Pakistan's early constitutions, objectives, tensions, and the search for a stable frame. Pakistan's constitutional story began with the Objectives Resolution of 1949, a foundational statement that sovereignty belongs to God, authority is a trust, and democratic principles, minority rights, and Islamic values must harmonize in the new polity. This balancing act reflected the twin birthmarks of Pakistan. It was created for Muslims, but inherited territories and peoples of deep linguistic and regional variety. Early political life revolved around assembling a workable center amid centrifugal pulls. The first constitution arrived only in 1956, declaring Pakistan an Islamic republic with a parliamentary system and a federal design that tried to reconcile West Pakistan's provinces with populous East Pakistan. One controversial device was the one-unit scheme, 1955, merging the western provinces into a single administrative block to establish parity with the eastern wing in the national legislature. The move aimed at stability but bred resentment, flattening real differences in the West and deepening the East's suspicion that demographic majority would never translate into political weight. Bureaucracy and the military, both strengthened by the imperatives of war and state building, increasingly shaped politics. Civil servants and generals came to see themselves as custodians of national purpose, especially when party quarrels seemed parochial. Governor General and then presidential interventions, dismissals of cabinets, and martial law in 1958 signaled an institutional drift away from the parliamentary spirit. Yet the constitutional conversation did not die. The 1962 Constitution experimented with basic democracies, a controlled, tiered system of local bodies meant to legitimate central rule. Islamic provisions coexisted with modern administrative forms. Courts asserted and then retreated in defining limits to executive power. Through all this, East Pakistan's language and development grievances hardened. If the state's frame could not respect Bengali as co-equal and could not deliver equitable investment, then the promise of 1947 looked compromised. Pakistan's constitutional odyssey thus reveals a country searching for a vocabulary that could unite Muslim identity with federal reality, an ambition noble and necessary, yet repeatedly undermined by fears that openness would invite disunity rather than manage it. Who belongs? Citizenship laws, minorities, and the lines inside the law. Citizenship after partition was never merely about passports. It was about healing and hierarchy. India's Citizenship Act of 1955 built on constitutional provisions to define pathways by birth, descent, registration, and naturalization, but the immediate post-partition years were dominated by the who returned when questioned. Displaced persons regimes tried to distinguish those who had crossed under duress from those who might cross opportunistically, with cutoff dates that turned migration into a race against paperwork. Liaquat, Nehru's 1950 pact promised minority protections and mechanisms for property restoration and return, a recognition that borders had not neatly reassigned conscience. Still, communal tension and local politics often mock treaty text. In Pakistan, citizenship definitions, too, contended with returnees, stranded populations, and the place of non-Muslim minorities. East Pakistan presented a special challenge. Cross-border family networks did not neatly align with legal categories, and seasonal or circular migrants to Calcutta or Assam risked falling between frames. Over time, each state produced further lines inside the law. In India, later decades would witness debates and amendments about illegal migration, especially in Assam, where the experience of partition overlapped with long-standing anxieties about land, labor, and identity. In Pakistan, the civic status of Ahmadis became a flashpoint, culminating in 1974 with their legal designation as non-Muslims, illustrating how the question of belonging could be legislated into narrower corridors. Meanwhile, the human residue of partition's choices lingered. Evacuee properties that tethered minority families to the state's suspicion, long queues for nationality certificates, and a heartbreaking category of people who were citizens in memory, but stateless in file. And yet, within these strictures, many minorities carved viable lives. Parsis in Karachi banking, Christians in Punjab education, Sikhs in Indian commerce, Muslims in Indian film and law, demonstrating that law sets a floor and a ceiling, but society often builds mezzanines of coexistence. The citizenship story, then, is a ledger of caution and courage, states hedging against imagined threats, citizens insisting that belonging can be proved not only by paper, but by decades of neighborliness and contribution. Bodies at the border, abduction, recovery, and the impossible return. The partition's most intimate wound fell upon women, whose bodies were turned into battlegrounds where communities performed vengeance, honor, and imagined sovereignty. Abductions, forced conversions, mass assaults, and coerced marriages unfolded alongside the great caravans and train massacres, but they also unfolded in courtyards and backrooms where neighbors once shared festivals and recipes. The new states responded with unprecedented legislation and bilateral protocols. India and Pakistan established central recovery operations with women social workers at the forefront. Special trains moved across the border bearing those who had been located and rescued. Camps in places like Jalandhar, Amritsar, Lahore, and Karachi became halfway worlds where law and kinship argued about identity. The 1949 Inter-Dominion Agreement formalized retrieval procedures and liaison officers. On paper, the mission was humanitarian and restorative, return women to their homes. On the ground, it collided with the unbearable complexity of time and choice. Some women had children with their captors or husbands. Others faced families that refused to accept them back. Community councils debated purity and pollution, while state officers insisted on files and cutoff dates. A woman could be both a victim and a wife by law, both a mother and a minority by rumor. Social workers, many of them from reformist and nationalist circles, found themselves negotiating not only with police and district magistrates, but with priests, Malvis, and landlords who claimed rights over female fate. The language of honor, invoked to justify rescue, could become a new prison when survivors were told to forget their attachment to children born in captivity or to convert once more to a natal creed. Yet there were also flashes of agency. Women who testified to stay with partners they had chosen in the chaos. Mothers who demanded custody arrangements that law could barely imagine. Widows who refused to return to villages where the men who killed their kin now sat on councils. The state's ledger marked recovered as a success metric, but for many survivors the true struggle began after the stamp. Reintegration in neighborhoods that could not see past gossip, marriages negotiated as compensation, and a daily battle to replace a name whispered in shame with a name spoken at school, at work, at the ration shop. In this crucible, women taught the new nations what sovereignty meant when the frontier ran through the human heart. Rebuilding lives, work, welfare, and the quiet radicalism of survival. Beyond the headlines of rescue, women carried the resettlement on their backs, literally with bundles of utensils and quilts, figuratively with strategies that converted grief into routines. In West Punjab and Delhi, widows formed cooperatives to stitch garments, roll incense sticks, cook pap ads, and manage neighborhood ration queues, transforming relief kitchens into micro-enterprises. Refugee schools recruited educated women as teachers and clerks. Nursing colleges and midwifery centers expanded, for governments realized that rebuilding demanded public health as much as policing. Pakistan's urban migration produced new female labor geographies. Muhajir families in Karachi depended on women's piecework. Punjabi towns developed bizarre economies where women bartered dowry goods for seed capital. Voluntary organizations, the All India Women's Conference, the Women's Relief Committees, Anjumani Khawateen, bridged state capacity gaps, teaching bookkeeping to those who had never signed their own names and running legal aid desks that translated benevolent statutes into usable rights. This quotidian labor, standing in line, filling forms, mastering bus routes, was not romantic, but it was politically profound. It relocated citizenship from the podium to the clinic, from the cabinet room to the neighborhood meeting. Caste and class complicated access. Upper caste refugee widows often secured better plots or compensation through social capital. Dalit women in peripheral colonies navigated both partition stigma and entrenched discrimination, finding in municipal sanitation jobs a precarious path to stability. In East Bengal and West Bengal, slow-motion migration meant housework and caregiving stretched across borders. Women shuttled between rural natal homes and urban squatter settlements, orchestrating kin networks that states slowly learned to see as welfare infrastructure rather than encroachment. Education policies, stipends for refugees, reserved seats for displaced persons, nursing scholarships, opened stairways that many climbed one tiring step at a time. The quiet radicalism here was not in manifestos, but in adaptability. Learning to use a new script, changing a daughter's school calendar to match camp water timings, convincing a skeptical landlord to accept a ration card as proof of solvency. These incremental victories did not erase violence, but they bent the arc of partition toward survival with dignity. In kitchens and clinics, a gendered republic took shape, one that still struggles with patriarchy, but one whose foundations were poured by women who refused to let catastrophe dictate their children's horizon. Memory, testimony, and the ethics of remembrance. For decades, the public archive of partition was dominated by official reports, diplomatic exchanges, and constitutional debates. Yet the most truthful records often lived in stories told after dinner, in trunks under beds, in songs hummed while cooking. Beginning in the 1970s and gaining momentum from the 1990s, oral history projects, universities by independent scholars, by community groups, began to record testimonies across classes, regions, and languages. The tapes revealed not a single narrative, but a chorus of partial truths. A Sikh grandmother who remembered hiding a Muslim neighbor's daughter in a grain bin. A Bengali Hindu who moved 5 times between 1947 and 1964, convinced each time that it was the last. A Kashmiri Muslim who recalled Indian soldiers distributing blankets and Pakistani raiders distributing fear in the same week. A Muhajir poet who lost a Lucknow courtyard but found a Karachi readership. These testimonies complicated the neatness of national scripts. They exposed how rumor manufactures massacre, how a single bureaucrat's kindness can redeem a month of cruelty, how children interpret borders as games until they are denied a school admission because their father lacks a paper. Literature and film carried this memory work into culture. Saadat Hassan Manto's Toba Tek Singh, Bisham Sani's Tamas, Ritwik Ghatuk's cinematic elegies, Intizar Hussein's allegories, Amrita Pritam's lament to Wari Shah, all insisted that mourning could be art without becoming spectacle. Museums and memorials, some official, many grassroots, raised practical questions. What should be displayed? How to avoid the pornography of pain? How to honor without restoking hatred? Academic debates over numbers and causality, necessary for public accountability, met the irreducible singularity of grief. To remember ethically is to resist two temptations: triumphalism that weaponizes memory for contemporary politics, and amnesia that sanitizes nation building. Schools tentatively added chapters, diaspora communities curated exhibitions, social media opened new corridors where grandchildren interview grandparents in living rooms far from the subcontinent. The ethics of remembrance also entails confronting complicity. Communities must face the ways in which our protectors became their predators on different days, and how silence can be a kind of vandalism against history. A mature memory culture recognizes that partition is both past and present tense, an event that ended in 1947 and a structure that continues to shape citizenship debates, border skirmishes, and neighborhood suspicions. To remember, then, is not to stay in 1947. It is to learn to live in 2025 and beyond, without letting old maps colonize new hearts. Languages, cinemas, and the everyday invention of national culture. Nations are not only made by constitutions and wars. They are made by songs on the radio, posters at bus stops, textbooks and sports rivalries, the grammar of road signage, and the taste of school lunches. After 1947, India and Pakistan each began assembling a cultural commons that could deliver a sense of belonging across provinces and classes. Language was the first, fiercest instrument. In India, the constitutional embrace of multilingualism met the practical needs of administration by elevating Hindi and English at the center, while states fought and won the right to arrange themselves around linguistic majorities. The States Reorganization Commission, 1956, redrew the political map so that school, radio, and bureaucracy could speak the same tongue as the bazaar. The result was not uniformity, but a new type of federal intimacy. A Tamil film star could become a chief minister. A Marathi theater tradition could shape a national acting style. Assamese poetry could travel through translation into school readers far away. In Pakistan, Urdu's symbolic role as a unifying language met the demographic gravity of Bengali. Radio Pakistan and PTV later curated a repertoire: ghazal, qawwali, folk music from Sindh and Punjab, that projected a national sensibility. But the language question in the East seeded a deeper quarrel about representation that would climax in 1971. Cinema, the great South Asian storyteller, both bridged and hardened borders. Bombay's film industry, inheriting studios, technicians, and a cosmopolitan audience, turned partition into metaphors. Families separated and reunited, villains who stood for greed and division, heroines who carried virtue across cities. Pakistani cinema in Lahore, Lollywood, crafting its own idioms, shown in melodrama, folk epics, and later urban romances, with singers like Noor Jahan liquidating grief in a voice. Censorship regimes in both countries negotiated how much of the other could be seen. Pirated tapes, and later satellite TV and streaming would make such negotiations quaint. Sports added a muscular soundtrack. Cricket fixtures became secular festivals where rivalry and respect coexisted, and hockey finals carried the thrum of shared pasts. Textbooks wrote canonical versions of history. Counterhistories found refuge in private tutoring and in the arts. This everyday invention of culture did not erase wounds, but it taught millions to inhabit their nations as users, not only as believers, to consume and critique, to attend concerts and file right-to-information requests, to debate syllabi and cheer for a teenage fast bowler whose dialect carried a border's lilt. The diaspora, memory in transit, capital in circulation, and soft power from afar. South Asian migration out of the subcontinent accelerated in post-partition decades, mapping new circuits that bent back to the homelands. Early streams included professionals fleeing scarcity and seeking stability, doctors for Britain's NHS, engineers for North American labs, teachers and accountants for East Africa and the Middle East. Later waves brought students and service workers, entrepreneurs, and IT specialists. For families who had already experienced 1947 as uprooting, international migration sometimes felt like a second, chosen dislocation, a chance to turn trauma into risk appetite. Diaspora neighborhoods, Southall, Jackson Heights, Brampton, Mississauga, Dubai's Dubai, Kuala Lumpur's brickfields, became laboratories where Punjabi and Gujarati, Sylheti and Pashto, Tamil and Urdu coexisted under English or Arabic signage. These communities built gurdwaras, manders, mosques, and cultural centers that archive partition and commemorations while raising funds for flood relief and school scholarships back home. Money remitted through bank wires, hawala, and later fintech apps stabilized rural economies and seeded urban real estate booms. Return visits financed weddings and hospitals. Hometown associations lobbied consulates and MPs. Diaspora media, magazines, radio shows, YouTube channels, curated memory, sometimes softening national edges in the name of nostalgia, sometimes sharpening them to play homeland politics by proxy. Soft power accrued. Bollywood and Pakistani music concerts filled stadiums. Diaspora authors, Salman Rushdie, Jhumpa Lahiri, Mohsin Hamid, Kamila Shamsi, Amitabh Ghosh, Arundhati Roy, translated subcontinental dilemmas into global idioms. Chefs turned biryani and nahari, dosa and chaat into culinary diplomacy. Yet diaspora life also reproduced partition's hierarchies. Caste traveled in matrimonial ads. Communal bias traveled in WhatsApp forwards. Homeland conflicts reappeared as protests outside embassies. A new generation, raised in Toronto or Birmingham or Doha, inherited the partition story filtered through grandparents' accents and school curricula that scarcely mentioned it. Many visited ancestral towns now across borders, discovering that memory's map does not always match Google's. Diaspora panchayats, formal and informal, brokered disputes over remittances, inheritance, and marriage with a cosmopolitan ruthlessness that echoed village politics. In short, migration turned the subcontinent into a planetary archipelago whose islands trade in money, music, memory, and moral claims. From afar, the diaspora extends influence back home. Voting blocs in constituencies that court NRI donations, development trusts that build libraries, and activist networks that demand accountability when borders flare. The story of partition thus finds an afterlife in Heathrow queues and Mississauga basements, in e-prayers at converted warehouses, and in Diwali lights strung across suburban cul-de-sacs. Beyond the binary, new movements, cross-border collaborations, and the future of belonging. If partition established a powerful binary, India/Pakistan, contemporary South Asia generates counterflows that complicate it. Cross-border research on rivers, glaciers, and monsoons requires scientists to share data because climate does not respect visas. Filmmakers collaborate digitally. Musicians sample across languages. Novelists publish in markets that censors cannot fully police. Trade, though often hostage to politics, sneaks through formal corridors and informal ones. Truck convoys at Wagah and Petropol cross with textiles, spices, surgical instruments, and sentiment, while e-commerce platforms make a mockery of old tariff imaginations. Civil society organizations arrange student dialogues and women's leadership summits. Historians share archives. Tech founders swap notes on regulation and venture capital. Meanwhile, new movements within each country, feminist campaigns against sexual violence, farmers' protests, environmental justice collectives, students defending academic freedom, redefine the public square in a vocabulary that simultaneously borrows from global norms and repurposes indigenous ethics. These movements often carry partition's lesson, that majoritarian certainty can be a brittle basis for unity, that citizenship must be defended at its margins to be meaningful at its center. In Kashmir and along the Bengal border, humanitarian concerns press against security doctrines. In Punjab, water sharing and agricultural futures reframe old resentments in ecological terms. In Karachi and Delhi, air quality makes a mockery of flags. Digital life both heals and harms. It enables friendships that bypass propaganda, diaspora tutoring for village classrooms, fundraising for medical emergencies across borders. It also accelerates rumor, conspiracy, and dehumanization at speeds that would have made 1947's demagogues envious. The future of belonging in the subcontinent may thus hinge on whether institutions can protect plural argument while securing material dignity, jobs, clean air and water, reliable courts, fair police. Memory work must continue, but not as an endless courtroom, rather as a commons that warns against purity politics and honors everyday bravery. If there is a post-partition imagination worth cultivating, it is one that treats borders as administrative facts and humans as moral facts, that sees the other not as a demographic threat or a poetic metaphor, but as a neighbor in line at a clinic, a collaborator on a research paper, a competitor on a cricket pitch, and a partner in saving a shared delta from a warming sea. That future will not erase the partition. It will, at last, place it in a museum where the plaques are read by citizens unafraid of each other's stories. 5-year dreams, planning, public sectors, and a technocratic republic. In the first post-partition decade, Indian policymakers sought to convert freedom into material dignity by transforming the state into an engine of planned development. The calamity of 1943's Bengal famine and the logistical chaos of 1947 had convinced leaders that markets alone could neither feed the poor nor knit a country of villages and new industrial corridors into one economy. The Planning Commission, chaired by the Prime Minister and advised by economists like P.C. Mahalanobis, orchestrated 5-year plans that treated investment as a moral arithmetic. Dams would become temples of modern India. Steel plants would be the skeletal frame of sovereignty, and roads would be the nerves through which commerce and citizenship could travel. Community development programs carried a Gandhian vocabulary into a status grammar. Village panchayats were courted as partners. Cooperative credit was expanded, and agricultural extension services tried to translate agronomy into harvests. The public sector became a theater of national pedagogy. Steel at Balai, Rourkela, and Durgapur, heavy machinery at Ranchi, fertilizers in Sindri, power projects across the Ganga and Narmada basins. Universities multiplied engineering seats and founded new institutes of technology, suggesting that science could be both a career and a civic virtue. Yet planning was never merely spreadsheets. It was politics clothed as engineering. Land reform promised to break feudal chokeholds, but implementation varied. In some regions, tenancy regulation and ceilings redistributed dignity along with acreage. In others, legal ingenuity and political patronage dulled the blade. Food procurement and rationing created a new relationship between farmer, trader, and state. Minimum support prices and public distribution offered floor and roof to volatile markets, but also birthed opportunities for rent-seeking. Critics accused the plans of overestimating the state's managerial capacity and underestimating entrepreneurship outside license regimes. Still, the early decades built a psyche of possibility. A village that had known only monsoon and monsoon failure learned to speak of tube wells and hybrid seeds. A town accustomed to artisanal workshops began to imagine assembly lines. The developmental republic, forged out of partition's insecurity, attempted something audacious, using law, budget, and bureaucracy to write a future where famine would be memory and modernity would be vernacularized into canal schedules, bus timetables, and factory sirens. Its successes were real. Its failures, too, were instructive, teaching later generations where planning needs markets and where markets require a conscientious state. Pakistan's search for takeoff, bureaucratic capitalism, aid, and uneven growth. Pakistan's planners confronted a different geometry, born with fewer industrial assets, saddled with the administrative ruptures of 1947, and facing the demographic dominance of a distant eastern wing. The state pursued growth through a compact among bureaucracy, military, and emergent business houses. Early U.S. and multilateral aid, secured through Cold War alignments, financed foreign exchange gaps, while the Pakistan Industrial Development Corporation incubated enterprises from textiles to chemicals, later privatizing them into a constellation of conglomerates. In West Pakistan, canal colonies and agrarian reform, less radical than rhetoric, supported a class of farmers who could invest in tube wells and tractors. In East Pakistan, jute exports fed urban treasuries that often spent more in Lahore and Karachi than in Dhaka. The 1960s, under Ayub Khan, advertised a decade of development. Growth rates rose, industrial clusters thickened around Karachi and Faisalabad, and large dams on the Indus system, Mangla, Tarbela, promised megawatts and irrigation discipline. A technocratic ethos, planning boards, cost-benefit analyses, basic democracies sought to substitute administrative clarity for messy party competition. But prosperity was not a neutral teacher. The genie of influence widened as swiftly as the income genie. Regional disparities hardened into political grievance. Bengali economists compiled the Ledger of Neglect, arguing that the Eastern Wing's foreign exchange earnings were underwriting Western factories while Dhaka streets crumbled and cyclones exposed infrastructural indifference. Labor in Karachi ports, students in Lahore, and peasants in the countryside learned to use strikes and slogans as counters to elite confidence. Aid that had been a lifeline became a leash in the public imagination. Import substitution that had cultivated domestic brands was criticized for breeding protected inefficiency. Yet, as in India, the pursuit of takeoff seeded institutions that would long outlive their founders. Planning cells and ministries, engineering faculties, development banks, and a culture of measuring progress, even when failing to distribute it fairly. The state's ambition, sharpened by partition's vulnerability, sought legitimacy through growth. Its tragedy was to conflate GDP with consent, forgetting that a development miracle that cannot be convincingly narrated in Sylheti, Pashto, Sindhi, Balochi, or Punjabi will be read, sooner or later, as someone else's miracle written on one's own ledger. Non-alignment, a diplomacy, and the tightrope over two superpowers. The developmental projects of both countries unfolded on a tightrope strung between Washington and Moscow. India's doctrine of non-alignment, articulated by Nehru and later institutionalized in the Banding Conference and the non-aligned movement, was not simply diplomatic theater. It was an economic strategy to court assistance from both blocs without becoming an appendage of either. Steel plants built with Soviet collaboration stood alongside river projects assisted by the World Bank. Agricultural research drew on American seed science, even as Indian diplomats criticized nuclear brinkmanship and colonial residues. Critics called non-alignment naive or moralistic, Supporters saw in it the only posture compatible with sovereignty and plural domestic opinion. Pakistan charted a different line, joining U.S.-led alliances like SEATO and CENTO, trading strategic geography for military aid and budgetary breathing room. American tanks rolled into parade grounds. Training missions professionalized the officer corps. Later, Chinese partnerships added a third vector of external patronage that would reshape trade, roads, and doctrine. These choices scripted each country's media and intellectual climates. Editorials in Delhi rehearsed the vocabulary of Afro-Asian solidarity and disarmament. Karachi's and Lahore's debates weighed security guarantees against domestic freedoms. Aid became a language citizens learned to interpret. A dam ribbon cutting was both water and geopolitics. A food aid ship docking was both relief and dependence. The Cold War thus laminated partition's map with new colors. Border skirmishes were read through alliance lenses, and development projects became proxies in global prestige contests. Yet neither country was merely a pawn. Both bargained, defected, hedged, and improvised. Scientists extracted scholarships, poets extracted publisher tours, bureaucrats extracted loan reschedulings. The tightrope was risky, but it expanded the repertoire of statecraft beyond battlefield and ballot. It turned economic diplomacy into a civic spectacle. Parliaments debated conditionalities. Newspapers tracked aid tranches, and villagers argued whether a canal was delayed by monsoon or by Moscow. In that argumentative public, the Cold War was domesticated, becoming less a confrontation of superpowers and more a running workshop where post-colonial states learned how to translate grand strategy into irrigation schedules and school building materials. 1947 to 65, from ceasefire to stalemate, and the education of two armies. The 1949 ceasefire in Kashmir did not close a chapter. It opened a syllabus. The armies that had inherited colonial drill books and mixed loyalties now acquired distinct doctrines shaped by terrain, alliances, and domestic politics. Skirmishes along the ceasefire line graduated into periodic crises. Patrol clashes taught cartography in blood. In 1962, India's humiliating conflict with China on the Himalayan frontier convulsed the strategic class, exposing deficits in logistics, intelligence, and political military coordination. That defeat, though outside the Indo-Pak dyad, set the stage for 1965 by catalyzing Indian rearmament and a more assertive defense establishment. Pakistan's leadership, reading India as weakened and Kashmir as restive, wagered that a limited conflict could alter the status quo. Operation Gibraltar infiltrated irregulars into the valley, betting on local uprising and international attention. Operation Grand Slam followed to threaten Aknur. India crossed the international border near Lahore, escalating the conflict beyond the mountains into the plains. The war's imagery, tanks in Sialkot's fields, dogfights over Punjab, sirens in Amritsar and Lahore, etched itself in a popular memory. Strategically, both sides learned that decisive victory was elusive under global scrutiny. Washington and Moscow, otherwise antagonists, converged in urging restraint. The United Nations choreographed ceasefire language that froze gains and losses into propaganda on both sides. The Tashkent Declaration, 1966, brokered by the Soviet Union, restored pre-war positions but left the Kashmir dispute intact, while domestic politics processed the war in contrasting keys. In Pakistan, the disappointment of an inconclusive outcome dented Ayub Khan's aura. In India, Lal Bahadur Shastri's wartime leadership and the slogan of Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, fused soldierly valor with agrarian revival. Military institutions internalized lessons. The premium on armor infantry coordination, the cost of intelligence mirages, the indispensability of air power, and the reality that public morale is a battlefield asset. Civilians, too, learned to read mobilization as a civic ritual. Blackouts, blood donation drives, school drills, patriotic cinema. Between 1947 and 1965, the ceasefire line became not just a line, but a curriculum in which two nations taught themselves what war could achieve, what it could not, and what price it would inevitably charge in widows, stipends, and balance of payment stress. 1971, war, genocide, and the birth of Bangladesh. The gravest aftershock of partition ripened in East Pakistan, where the language crisis of 1948 to 52 matured into a broader indictment of political and economic marginalization. The 1970 cyclone that killed hundreds of thousands and the central government's slow response exposed a moral distance between rulers and ruled. In December 1970, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's Awami League won an absolute majority in Pakistan's first general elections on a platform of autonomy. The refusal to transfer power, followed by the March 1971 military crackdown, Operation Searchlight, turned constitutional crisis into civil war. Accounts of mass atrocities, killings of students and intellectuals, village burnings, systematic sexual violence, poured across the border with millions of refugees into India's eastern states, overwhelming Assam, Tripura, and West Bengal. India's calculus fused security, humanitarian, and political strands. Hosting refugees strained resources. Insurgent training camps signaled a commitment to Bengali self-determination. Diplomatic campaigns sought to frame the crisis as genocide rather than merely an internal matter. War came in December after months of escalating skirmishes and after West Pakistani airstrikes on Indian airfields. On the Western Front, familiar armor thrusts and dogfights replayed 1965's theater. In the East, the conflict was swift and decisive, with Indian forces coordinating with the Mukti Bahini to encircle Dhaka. The surrender on December 16th, 1971 birthed Bangladesh, a sovereign state whose anthem and flag had long been composed in hearts before being raised on poles. For Pakistan, the trauma was existential. A country created to secure a Muslim political homeland had lost its demographic majority amid charges of crimes against the very citizens whose faith had been the founding premise. For India, victory delivered strategic depth and moral vindication, but also a complex neighbor with enormous reconstruction needs and its own politics of memory. The Simla Agreement, 1972, reframed the Kashmir ceasefire line as the line of control and pledged bilateralism, but the deeper lesson lay elsewhere, that a state cannot indefinitely narrate nationhood while refusing linguistic dignity and fair development, that refugees are not merely numbers but geopolitical sentences waiting for punctuation, and that military success does not end the work of peacemaking. It only creates a new table on which future bargains must be written. From Pokhran to Shagai, deterrence, Kargil, and the long nuclear shadow. The final arc in partition's strategic story is nuclear. India's 1974 peaceful nuclear explosion at Pokhran announced a technological threshold without an accompanying doctrine. Sanctions followed, but so did a deepening of indigenous research and a national mythos of scientific self-reliance. Pakistan, reading the signal as an existential threat, accelerated its own clandestine program, weaving together diaspora expertise, covert procurement, and a political consensus that deterrence was the only antidote to demographic and conventional asymmetry. In 1998, India conducted a series of tests at Pokhran 2, declaring itself a nuclear weapon state and unveiling a doctrine of credible minimum deterrence and no first use. Days later, Pakistan answered at Shagai. Its mountains turned to testimony by subterranean thunder. The nuclearization of the dyad reconfigured crisis playbooks. Limited war, once the dream of hawks, now carried escalatory risks that diplomats and generals had to game out in real time. The 1999 Kargil conflict, sparked by infiltration across the line of control into high-altitude positions overlooking vital supply routes, tested whether conventional skirmish could be fought under the nuclear umbrella. India's military campaign, backed by international pressure on Pakistan to withdraw, restored positions. Both sides drew lessons about surveillance, political control of war aims, and the utility of global opinion when nuclear shadow makes great power mediation inevitable. Subsequent crises, Parliament attack, 2001, Mumbai, 2008, cross-border strikes and counterstrikes, played out in a vocabulary where signaling mattered as much as shells. Hotline calls, diplomatic démarches, media choreography, and calibrated mobilizations designed to punish without provoking catastrophic miscalculation. Deterrence did not pacify the frontier. It domesticated it into a dangerous routine. For ordinary people, nuclearization meant air raid drills in border schools, iodine rumors, and a surreal coexistence of cricket diplomacy with missile parades. For strategists, it meant constant tinkering with force postures, command and control, and second strike survivability. The long nuclear shadow is not merely technical, it is moral. It asks whether two nations born from a tragic partition can trust each other enough to share a river, a market, a film festival, yet distrust each other so profoundly that they ensure their sovereignty with weapons that promise mutual ruin. The answer, so far, has been to manage the contradiction, to talk when tempers cool, to rally when tempers flare, and to live, uneasily but resolutely, with the knowledge that the ultimate border may now run through a button guarded by doctrine and, one hopes, by wisdom. Seeds, water, power. How science and the state rewrote the harvest. When famine memories haunted the early republics, the Green Revolution arrived as both science and statecraft. High-yielding varieties, HYV, of wheat and rice, bred to respond dramatically to fertilizers and irrigation, promised to convert hunger into surplus. In India, foundations laid by earlier planning met new global partnerships. The Rockefeller and Ford Foundation supported research networks. The Indian Agricultural Research Institute refined breeding, and international centers like CIMMYT and IRRI supplied germplasm that local scientists adapted to subcontinental soils. The political bargain was as important as the seed. Guaranteed procurement prices through the Food Corporation of India and public distribution outlets that turned grain into a social wage. Extension services that taught farmers new input schedules. Rural electrification that pumped groundwater into fields, and cooperative credit that tried to wean cultivators from moneylenders charging ruinous rates. Punjab, Haryana, and western Uttar Pradesh became laboratories of abundance. Tube wells dotted the plains like silver buttons. Threshers hummed in winter nights, and village landscapes filled with straw stacks taller than some homes. In Pakistan, the Indus Basin Works, canal lining, link canals, Mangla, and Tarbela dams negotiated under the Indus Waters Treaty offered the hydraulic backbone for HYV adoption. The West surged ahead in wheat yields and cotton, while agricultural research stations experimented with pest management and heat tolerance. The revolution was not simply technological, it was logistical. Railways had to move grain in rhythms aligned with procurement. Cold chains and rural roads had to keep pace. Banks learned seasonal lending with political expectations attached. Electricity subsidized pumps, diesel greased threshers, and fertilizer factories became symbols of sovereignty. Even culture bent to agronomy. Sowing songs adopted new calendars. Harvest festivals celebrated mechanized rhythms, and village gossip acquired a vocabulary of NPK ratios and MSP politics. Critics warned of ecological costs and class bias. Yet for a generation that remembered ration lines and famine photographs, the sight of government go-downs overflowing felt like a moral reprieve. The Green Revolution thus stitched together seed genetics, irrigation grids, and price policy into a national narrative that the state could, with enough science and enough political will, change the fate of a monsoon civilization. That belief, tested, amended, and sometimes betrayed, would remain a cornerstone of South Asian developmental imagination long after the first miracle harvest faded into routine. Winners, losers, and the costs hidden in the bounty. Abundance did not fall evenly. HYB packages rewarded those who could finance the full bundle. Certified seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, pumps, and timely labor. Medium and large cultivators, especially in canal colonies and tube well belts, scaled up quickly, buying tractors on soft loans and leasing in land from smaller neighbors who could not keep pace. Tenancy laws, designed to protect sharecroppers, were unevenly enforced. In some districts, tenants gained security and bargaining strength, but in others they were informally evicted to avoid legal claims, reappearing as casual laborers or urban migrants. Caste hierarchies mapped onto these agrarian shifts. Dominant castes and Biradharis, already controlling village councils and credit flows, converted the Green Revolution into political leverage, funding local strongmen and district-level parties that promised better procurement centers and electricity feeders. Women's labor intensified but remained undercounted. Seedling transplantation, weeding, post-harvest sorting, tasks crucial to yield but rarely reflected in wages or land titles. Ecologically, the miracle carried a bill. Groundwater tables fell as pumps multiplied. Canal seepage salinized fields. Monocultures narrowed biodiversity. Pest cycles adapted faster than extension pamphlets. Pesticide exposure raised public health alarms, and small ruminants lost grazing commons fenced for irrigation channels. In the east, eastern Up Bihar, parts of Bengal, where river regimes are fickle and land ownership more fragmented, gains were slower. Flood-prone tracts needed drainage governance as much as seed science, and patronage often diverted resources away from embankment maintenance towards short-term spectacle. In Pakistan's cotton districts, pesticide resistance and waterlogging demanded continuous adaptation. Land reforms promised by successive regimes rarely dented the estates of politically connected families. The bounty altered culture and politics. Dowries inflated with displays of tractors and harvesters. Farmers' unions in India learned to lobby with highway blockades and procurement season leverage. Rural youth sought diplomas that would convert field capital into city opportunity. Meanwhile, the state discovered its own dependence. Once procurement systems grew, rolling them back risked both hunger politics and electoral punishment. By the 1990s, policy debates shifted from simply producing more grain to producing more wisely. Crop diversification, micro-irrigation, integrated pest management, and remunerative horticulture. The Green Revolution had succeeded in its first mission, banishing large-scale famine, but it had also created a new frontier where justice meant not only caloric security, but fair shares of profit, water, and voice. East Pakistan to Bangladesh and beyond. Rice frontiers, flood control, and food sovereignty. On the Delta's eastern wing, the story followed a different monsoon. East Pakistan's agrarian economy was rice-centered, river-braided, and cyclone-prone. The 1960s saw packages of HYV rice, IR-8, later IR-20 and IR-64, arrive with promise, but their success depended on seasonal choreography. Burro rice needed irrigation in the dry season. Amman had to dodge floods. AUS relied on early rains. Tube wells and low-lift pumps, often supplied through public programs or NGO microcredit after independence, turned borough into a game changer by the late 1970s and 1980s, especially in Bangladesh. Village entrepreneurship flourished around pump rental markets. Blacksmith shops pivoted to repairing diesel engines. Women's groups organized savings to buy small irrigation gear, tying gender empowerment to yield curves. Post-1971 Bangladesh rebuilt food systems with relentless focus. Cyclone shelters, flood early warning, and a lattice of NGOs, BRAC, Grameen, and others, delivered extension, credit, and social services where state capacity was thin. Rice breeding emphasized flood, salinity, and submergence tolerance. The later SUB1 varieties would allow plants to hold breath during shore inundations, while brackish aquaculture in the Southwest diversified incomes even as it sparked conflicts over land and water rights. Nutrition policy learned to think beyond rice. Homestead gardens, fish culture in rice fields, and school feeding connected calories to micronutrients. Pakistan's West, meanwhile, wrestled with Indus water politics, between provinces, between crops, between upstream dams and downstream delta. The Indus Waters Treaty survived wars and tantrums, proving that even rivalry can share a river through rules. Yet within Pakistan, tussles over canal rotations and illegal lift points made water a permanent negotiation. As climate change intensified variability, glacier melt, erratic monsoons, cyclones like Sidr and Ayla, the region's food sovereignty conversation matured. Storage, crop insurance, resilient seed, and cross-border grain trade became security, not just economics. Migration emerged as agrarian shock absorber. Young men from Bihar and Eastern up commuting seasonally to Punjab's harvests. Bangladeshi workers staffing Dhaka's garment boom to send remittances back to paddy fields. In village courtyards from Kumala to Multan, farmers debated not only price and rain, but mobile alerts, weather apps, and remittance timing. The Delta and the desert thus wrote their own green revolutions. Less photogenic than the first wheat miracle, perhaps, but equally consequential in teaching the subcontinent to adapt. The partition's afterlife in agriculture, then, is a tale of plural modernities. Different rivers, different seeds, one stubborn ambition to feed families with dignity while the sky grows stranger. Urban rush, informal economies, housing struggles, and the politics of everyday survival. By the 1970s, South Asia's cities were magnets pulling people displaced by agrarian change, conflict, and aspiration. Bombay, later Mumbai, Delhi, Calcutta, Kolkata, Karachi, Lahore, and Dhaka swelled beyond municipal imagination. Formal industry provided some anchors: textile mills, ports, railway workshops, engineering clusters, but the real engine was informal work. Headloaders at wholesale markets, cart pullers, street vendors, home-based artisans stitching garments or assembling electrical components for subcontractors who fed export orders. Slums were not aberrations, but architectures of necessity. Dharavi in Bombay, Orangi in Karachi, busties along Calcutta's canals, Kachia bodies in Lahore. Residents built homes room by room, at night, with borrowed money and political protection. Water arrived in tankers whose schedules taught entire neighborhoods to keep time by plastic buckets. Electricity came via kunda hooks that made power both a commodity and a collective action. NGOs and community organizations, Spark and Mahila Milan in Mumbai, the Orangi pilot project in Karachi, reimagined slum dwellers as co-producers of infrastructure, laying sewers, surveying lanes, negotiating with city engineers. Municipal politics learned that votes live in labyrinths. Councilors and party workers brokered connections for illegal taps, ration cards, and school admissions. Police managed order through discretion. not only law. Communal and ethnic mobilizations intersected with the urban economy. Strikes and riots closed markets, altered trade routes, and redrew residential segregation. Women's urban labor became a silent balance sheet. Domestic work, biddy rolling, piece rate garment stitching, financing school fees that parents hoped would convert precarious present into salaried future. Transport defined dignity. Bus conductors who could insult or protect. Train platforms where millions choreographed their mornings. Rickshaw pullers who learned to decode accents from across the subcontinent. In Dhaka and Chittagong, the garment industry's rise turned entire neighborhoods into supply chains, with dorm-like rooms stacked above cutting floors and cafeterias selling subsidized rice to keep needle hands steady. In Delhi, squatter evictions and resettlement colonies shifted poverty to new peripheries. In Lahore, canal-side neighborhoods mixed military cantonment order with bizarre chaos. Cities, in this period, taught citizens to be both impatient and ingenious. They invented credit out of kinship, transit out of chance, and safety out of solidarity. And they taught states that development without affordable housing, predictable transport, and fair policing was an invitation to permanent crisis. One that would be answered inexorably by movements, ballots, and, when ignored, by flames. Liberalization, Islamization, and the remaking of political economy. The global headwinds of the 1980s and early 1990s, oil shocks, debt crises, the end of the Cold War, collided with domestic constraints to trigger policy pivots. In India, a balance of payments crisis in 1991 forced a dramatic liberalization. Delicensing, tariff cuts, rupee devaluation, an embrace of private and foreign investment. Software services, telecom, and pharmaceuticals became sunrise sectors. Stock markets shed sleepy public sector paternalism for volatile ambition. Middle-class consumption acquired a new grammar of brands and cable TV. Special economic zones and IT parks refigured urban skylines, while state governments competed to attract capital with tax holidays and land banks. Critics warned of jobless growth and agrarian neglect. Supporters celebrated sunrise industries and poverty reduction through faster expansion. Pakistan's trajectory braided market reform with geopolitical realignments. Under Zero-ul-Haq, Islamization reshaped legal and social norms, even as labor migrations to the Gulf poured remittances into urban real estate and consumption. The 1980s saw financial liberalization and privatizations that strengthened business families and banks, but political instability and sanctions cycles complicated long-term investment. Export-led growth leaned on textiles and apparel. Karachi's ports and power plants became bargaining chips in a tense dance among federal, provincial, and city authorities. In Bangladesh, structural adjustment and a pragmatic export pushed birth a garment powerhouse. Quota systems under the multi-fiber arrangement, entrepreneur networks, and women's labor synthesized into a comparative advantage that reoriented the national economy toward factories rather than fields. NGOs complemented the state in microfinance and health, keeping social indicators climbing even when politics seesawed. Across the region, liberalization also remapped the social contract. Where the state had once promised jobs and rations, it now promised opportunity and infrastructure. Regulatory capacity lagged. Industrial pollution scarred rivers. Unsafe workplaces turned disasters into headlines, and land acquisition for highways and SCZs ignited rural movements. Television and later satellite news stitched markets to moods in real time. A currency wobble in Bangkok could jitter Dalal Street. A strike in Faisalabad could delay shipments to London. A factory fire in Dhaka could mobilize global boycotts. The partition's economic heirs thus entered a new adulthood. no longer pleading for aid as supplicants, but bargaining in supply chains as competitors, while still carrying the family arguments about equity, identity, and the state's role in refereeing both. Labor, unions, and the great recomposition from mills to malls. If a single image captures this era's labor story, it is a shuttered textile mill gate in Bombay juxtaposed with an air-conditioned mall rising a few miles away. The long strike of Bombay mill workers in the early 1980s, led by Dutta Samant, marked a turning point. Militant, massive, and ultimately defeated by a convergence of employer strategy, state policy, and real estate arithmetic that valued land more than looms. The decline of centralized union power in formal industry coincided with the explosion of informal and subcontracted labor. In Pakistan, Karachi's labor militancy, once anchored in docks and mills, was fragmented by deindustrialization, ethnic politics, and the rise of small workshops spread across hazardous, unregulated zones. In Bangladesh, the garment sector's phenomenal growth created millions of jobs for women, redrawing gender norms, but also exposing them to unsafe buildings, low wages, and union busting. Tragedies like Spectrum, 2005, and Rana Plaza, 2013, slightly beyond our period but rooted in this phase, would later force global and local reforms in compliance, inspections, and brand accountability. India's liberalization years saw new union experiments. SUA in Gujarat organized self-employed women, vegetable vendors, biddy rollers, home-based producers, pioneering health insurance and micro-pensions. Transport and municipal workers learned to negotiate essential service leverage. IT employees debated forms of collective action suited to white-collar precarity. Courts became arenas where labor law tried to keep up with triangular employment relations. Principal employer, contractor, worker, while flexibility entered managerial vocabularies as both necessity and euphemism. Yet the same landscapes nurtured resilient civic life. Mothers of the disappeared marched with photographs. Students recorded oral histories. Village councils negotiated ceasefire rituals around harvest and festivals. Poets smuggled metaphors past censors. In time, some conflicts found partial settlements, autonomy packages, peace accords, truth commissions, without fully curing the wounds. Others simmered, flaring when a killing or a court verdict or a foreign incursion reignited the argument. The security state's long war, then, is a test of Republican character. Can a nation protect itself without losing itself? Can it tell its soldiers that victory includes restraint? Can it tell its citizens that dissent is oxygen, not arson? In this exam, better equipment and better roads matter, but better ethics matter more. And they must be taught not only in academies, but in classrooms and courtrooms where the syllabus includes shame and atonement alongside sovereignty. New nationalisms, new minorities, markets, media, and the politics of recognition. As liberalization and globalization rewired economies, nationalism also updated its software. Consumer citizenship, buying local brands, celebrating startup unicorns, cheering satellite launches, joined older repertoires of sacrifice and service. Diaspora remittances and venture capital mingled with domestic capital to sponsor a swagger that measured respect not only in tank parades, but in export ledgers and streaming hits. Media conglomerates, social platforms, and targeted advertising made identity segmentation a profitable science. Regional pride campaigns sold telecom plans. Devotional content drove watch time metrics. Political micro-targeting converted grievances into granular get-out-the-vote operations. New minorities came into view. Migrant gig workers navigating city borders enforced by algorithms. Linguistic communities asserting rights in states where they were once quiet. religious sects negotiating visibility under majoritarian spotlights, LGBTQ plus citizens carving legal ground, sometimes with historic court wins, often with fragile social acceptance. Citizenship debates sharpened around documentation. National registers, identity-linked welfare, biometric databases, promising efficiency while provoking anxieties born in 1947 about who counts and who is counted out. Courts arbitrated, often split, sometimes bold, sometimes cautious, in rulings that resketched the boundary between individual rights and collective will. Universities turned into battlegrounds where free speech, sedition, and safe campuses were argued in slogans and footnotes. Comedians, filmmakers, and novelists found their stages both enlarged by digital reach and narrowed by vigilante offense-taking. Meanwhile, cross-border cultural exchange proved stubborn. Musicians collaborated across visa regimes. Cricket leagues drafted talent irrespective of passports until geopolitics intervened, and YouTube comments became unlikely laboratories of empathy and of abuse. The petition's bequest here is double. It supplied the cautionary tale about purity politics and demographic fear. It also supplied the institutional tools: a written constitution, judicial review, civil society networks, to resist their worst outcomes. New nationalisms will endure. The question is whether they can mature in a civic pride that is comfortable with critique, or whether they will harden into surveillance of neighbors' kitchens and lovers. The future of South Asian identity will likely be decided not in summit meetings, but in school boards, municipal councils, and company HR policies. Not in one grand verdict, but in countless micro-compromises that keep pluralism alive. If the region's next chapter is to outgrow partition's most punishing scripts, it will be because citizens insist that belonging is measured not by whom you exclude, but by what you build together. Libraries and legal aid desks, flood shelters and film clubs, startup incubators and street kitchen langars. Ordinary miracles that make a flag feel less like a command and more like a shared, breathable sky. Checkposts, corridors, and fences. How a political line became a daily landscape. The border, born in 1947, was a legal sentence written on maps. Over decades, it matured into a daily landscape with its own routines, rituals, and risks. At Atari, Wagah, the evening flag ceremony, half pageant, half semaphore, turns sovereignty into choreography, boots stamping and turbans flaring before soldiers exchange handshakes that are as studied as the scowls that precede them. At Petropol, Benapole on the Bengal frontier, the choreography is less photogenic but more decisive. Queues of trucks idle beneath billboards promising seamless trade, while drivers memorize the order of desk windows like a liturgy: customs, quarantine, security, road tax, then back to customs for a stamp that makes the journey legal. Between these showcases are hundreds of smaller gates and informal tracks where daily life collides with the state's insistence on documentation. In Punjab, farmers cultivate fields straddling the fence's shadow, watching Border Security Force, BSF, patrols, and Pakistan Rangers pace parallel duties like mirrored shadows at dusk. In Bengal's riverine stretches, the line falters where silt and channel shift. Fishermen read currents and rumors together, testing how far their nets may drift before a shouted warning becomes a shot. Fencing, electrified lights, and floodlit berms have hardened many stretches of the frontier, yet permeability persists. Goats wander through breaks. Monsoon washes out flood banks. Smugglers test vigilance with sacks of cough syrup or spices. And teenagers carry small consignments because the law is less likely to crush a minor as it would an adult. Airports and consulates are also borders, producing a parallel ritual. Visa queues were marriage certificates. Bank statements and school letters are offered as proof of good faith. Interviews in which family stories are distilled into biometrics. And the moment when a passport returned from a window with either a sticker of relief or a stamp of refusal. The border is a lesson in simultaneity. It is at once militarized and mundane, dangerous and domestic. Villages hold wedding processions that brush against the fence. Festivals amplify loudspeakers that drift across rice paddies into another country's air. Schoolboys trade cricket scores shouted across a ditch. The line polices contraband, yes, but it also polices time. Curfew hours, convoy slots, seasonal schedules for cross-border hots, where barter of fish, fruit, and spices is allowed in carefully bounded bazaars. These hots, revived in the past decade on parts of the India-Bangladesh frontier, are tiny armistices where grand politics is suspended so that tomatoes can find buyers and weavers can sell gamchas without visas. The border has thus become an ecology of control and accommodation, where the state learns to live with the small leakages that keep borderland societies alive, and borderland societies learn to live with the large rigidities that keep states reassured. Enclaves, statelessness, and the paperwork of belonging. Not all borders are lines. Some are puzzles. For decades, the Cooch Behar, Rangpur region contained a cartographic absurdity. Indian enclaves within Bangladesh and Bangladeshi enclaves within India, some with counter-enclaves nested like jokes told by surveyors who had lost their patience. Residents owed allegiance to a state they could not physically reach without trespassing through another's territory. Police feared to enter. Services arrived by whim more often than by plan. In 2015, a land boundary agreement finally exchanged these enclaves, turning limbo into locality. But the afterlife of paperwork lingered. New IDs to be issued, schools to be recognized, land titles to be regularized, so that a daughter could inherit a courtyard her grandmother had swept for 40 years. Elsewhere, the paperwork of belonging has been a slow trial. On the Assam frontier, lists and tribunals have tried to distinguish citizen from foreigner in a landscape where families straddle rivers and histories. The promise of legal rectitude wrestles with the risk of bureaucratic injustice when flood and poverty scatter documents like leaves. Borderlanders live with an intimate knowledge of the state's filing cabinets. They keep plastic-wrapped bundles of receipts, ration cards, immunization certificates, and school-leaving slips as if defending a case that never quite reaches a verdict. In Sindh's deserts and Kutch's salt flats, pastoralists' red cloud and pasture migration across a line that does not align with camel instinct. A lost herd can become a consular incident. In the Sundarbans, mangrove creeks make sovereignty amphibious. Tigers hunt without visas. Storms rub out survey stones. And a fisherman's widow can rarely tell which country's Coast Guard found the boat's last plank. Across these geographies runs a second border between those who are legible to the state and those who are not. To be legible is to have a name spelled the same way across every form. To be illegible is to carry 3 spellings and discover that none match the registry. Women suffer this border's bite more often, their natal names and married names out of sync with camp lists, their lack of property deeds interpreted as lack of existence. Minorities who stayed after 1947, Sikhs in Pakistan, Hindus and Christians in both countries, Muslims in India, learned that belonging could be both legal and precarious, affirmed by a judge yet questioned by a neighbor who reads rumor as evidence. And still people make lives. Enclave residents celebrate the first post office as a civic festival. Assam villages host legal aid camps under banyan trees. Paralegals teach neighbors to archive SMS receipts from electricity boards as proof of continuity. In this way, the paperwork of belonging, tedious, sometimes cruel, becomes paradoxically communal, a craft learned together so that a border does not erase a lineage with a typist's error. Circulation, contraband, and the smell of cross-border markets. Borders are also economies with distinct smells. Diesel and cardamom at Petropol, jute fiber and spilled tea near Siliguri, tar, cattle, and chili dust along Rajasthan's cargo routes. Brine and fish at coastal checks where Sir Creek's legal ambiguity meets a trawler's hunger for a good catch. Partition fractured circuits, but it also created niches. Traders who once supplied Calcutta from East Bengal learned to pivot to Nepal in the northeast. Punjabi wholesalers mapped Dubai as their hinterland. Karachi's corridor tightened its links to the Gulf and East Africa. Benapole petty traders mastered the art of passenger baggage, allowances to move small electronics and fabric bolts in legal gray. Smuggling is not a romantic story. Its underbelly includes violence, child porters, and debt bondage, but is sociologically instructive. When formal corridors thicken in paperwork and delays, informal corridors grow arteries. Cattle, banned here, prized there, become the moral and monetary center of a police blotter. Cough syrup bottles and cheap sedatives, legal on one side, abused on the other, ride motorcycle panniers at night. Hillsaw fish cross with diplomatic exemptions and with plastic-wrapped secrecy, depending on season and sentiment. States adapt in layered ways. Border hots legalized the micro-exchange that kept villages fed anyway. Bonded warehouses digitized customs to strangle rent-seeking. Scanners replace some inspections, though never the discretion that lubricates an underpaid official's end of month. Meanwhile, people do what they have always done, make circulation into survival. A Bangladeshi mason works a season in Malda, sending cash home with a driver who also carries saris as gifts. A Sindhi Hindu family in Gujarat hosts a visiting cousin from Karachi for medical treatment, knowing that hospital corridors are softer than visa windows. A Sikh pilgrim walks through the Kartarpur corridor to visit a shrine whose domes predate the line's anxieties by centuries. Contraband and devotion, bureaucracy and barter coexist like the warp and weft of a borderland shawl. The larger economy, too, takes notes. Logistics firms invest in cold chains to keep mangoes from turning to mush accuse. Fintech apps target drivers with microinsurance. Truck stops evolve into townlets where mechanics, prayer rooms, snack stalls, and sim vendors supply a proletariat mobility that keeps national accounts alive. The border, then, is not the end of a world, but the edge of many overlapping ones. Some legal, some tolerated, some condemned, all persistent because geography and human need will always negotiate with law. Rivers as treaties and lifelines, from Indus to Ganges and Teesta. If partitions slice states, rivers refused amputation. The Indus system, born in Himalayan glaciers and braided through Punjab and Sindh, demanded a constitutional imagination larger than nationalism. The Indus Waters Treaty, brokered during the Cold War, allocated the 3 eastern rivers largely to India and the 3 western rivers largely to Pakistan, financing vast engineering works, canal linkages, storages, barges that rewired both economies. That treaty's durability through wars is more than diplomatic lore. It is daily irrigation schedules, crop calendars, and municipal taps that do not stop merely because flags scowl. Downstream, the Ganga and Brahmaputra carry silt, fish, and political suspicion from the high snows to delta mud. The Farakka barrage, designed to flush silt from Calcutta port, also rearranged hydrology and sentiment in Bangladesh. A later Ganges water-sharing pact tried to temper seasonal pain with arithmetic, and joint commissions now perform the quiet miracle of hydrological diplomacy, exchanging data even when editorials shout. The Teesta remains a lesson in federal complexity, a river that must be negotiated not only between nations, but between New Delhi and a state capital that guards its farmers' anxieties. In all these basins, climate change is a new scribe, rewriting hydrographs with glacier retreat, erratic monsoons, and extreme rainfall events that turn design assumptions into miscalculations. Riverbank erosion displaces villages that then appear as encroachers on someone else's register. Char islands are born and die with a caprice that surveys struggle to capture. Fishermen discover that fish migrate earlier, smaller, differently. Yet water is not only scarcity, it is cooperation's best teacher. Flood forecasting nodes share upstream rainfall data that saves downstream lives. Boat clinics in Assam and Bangladesh deliver vaccines to cut banks. Embankment committees learn that protection needs silt trap ecology as much as sandbags. Farmers experiment with short-duration rice and millets that laugh at drought. Women's groups manage tube well committees that ration groundwater with a fairness rare in parliaments. Cities rediscover riverside commons with promenades and wastewater treatment, even as unplanned growth still pours poison into streams. The lesson of shared rivers is not sentimental. It is institutional. Agreements must be designed to survive headline cycles. Engineers must speak to sociologists, and meteorologists must speak to school teachers so that a flood bulletin becomes action rather than panic. The partition line, when drawn across a river, is a hypothesis that hydrology disproves every season. The only durable answers are joint gauges, joint rules, and a joint humility before water. Deltas, cyclones, and the Sundarbans, a mangrove republic under two flags. At the mouth of the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Meghna, the world's largest delta, meets the Bay of Bengal in a labyrinth of creeks and islands that do not care for passport control. The Sundarbans, shared by India and Bangladesh, is a living rampart against storm surge, its mangrove shattering wave energy, its mud banks absorbing blows that would otherwise flatten towns. Cyclones, Bola, Sidr, Ayla, Ampon, Mocha, are not only meteorological events, they are constitutional tests. Early warning systems, shelters raised on stilts, cyclone-resistant housing designs, and evacuation drills have already saved hundreds of thousands compared to 1970, proving that governance can turn a killer into a hardship. Yet every storm writes a quieter tragedy. Salinized ponds that poison kitchen gardens. Embankments scoured by tide. Repaired, then scoured again. Men migrating for brick kiln work while women guard homesteads from erosion and crocodiles. Tigers test new hunting grounds when deer populations thin. Hunter-gatherers navigate both wildlife and rules. Forest guards caught between poachers and poverty enforced with discretion that sometimes feels like fate. After each storm, the border asserts itself in relief logistics. Permits for boats, clearances for NGOs, customs for tarpaulins, and yet villagers on both sides tell the same stories about the burn of saline on cracked feet and the taste of rainwater after months of brine. Sea level rise is no longer a graph. It is a school moving inland twice in a decade. Adaptation here is granular and ingenious. Floating gardens anchored by water hyacinth, salt-tolerant paddy, and prawns rotated with rice and negotiated commons. Raised tube well platforms, and village committees that map safe routes through mangrove at low tide. Cross-border research on mangrove species, tiger movement, and cyclone modeling has multiplied, but institutional jealousy still hobbles data sharing that could save lives. Insurance pilots struggle to price risk in villages where a surname can move with the riverbank. Microcredit cushions recovery, but cannot replace a buffalo swept to sea. There is also an ethics of retreat to learn. Not every embankment should be rebuilt. Not every island defended and relocation, so hard for cultures tied to shrine and grove, must be designed with dignity, livelihoods, and ritual continuity in mind. The Sundarbans teaches a politics of humility. The mangrove thrives by yielding, by filtering, by growing from the detritus of flood. Two republics can learn from a forest that knows no flag, cooperate on sediment management, sediment budgets, and planned openings that let silt rebuild land, treat poaching as a transboundary crime, and protect the ranger and the honey-gatherer with as much fervor as any industrial corridor. Because in this century, a mangrove is not only a forest, it is critical infrastructure. Air, heat, and the city is climate classroom. If rivers and deltas narrate climate at the scale of basins, cities narrate it at the scale of lungs and skin. Delhi wakes to particulate advisories that read like weather reports. Lahore counts crop-burning plumes as if they were visiting armies. Dhaka calculates the price of cooling a room when the grid size in May. Air pollution, heat islands, and erratic rainfall are less photogenic than flood rescues, but more relentless in their arithmetic of harm. Stroke wards crowded in heat waves. Children's test scores dented by bad air, productivity shaved from factory floors, and informal workers choosing between a day's wage and a day's shade. The border's afterlife appears here as policy echo, a stubble management subsidy design in one country shifts air in the other. Brick kiln standards in Punjab, on either side, determine winter haze. Coal plant retirements, natural gas prices, and LNG import contracts tug at each other's grids via power trade that policy is only beginning to imagine at scale. Yet the city is also a climate classroom where citizens learn that mitigation and adaptation can be as local as a lane. Rooftop solar and community batteries turn load shedding into microgrid experiments. Cool roofs, lime wash, reflective membranes. Trim indoor temperatures by degrees that feel like mercy. Bus rapid transit corridors move workers faster with fewer emissions. Cycling lanes, when actually respected, stitch together neighborhoods with a mobility that belongs to the poor as much as to the woke. Waste becomes both villain and resource. Landfills smolder while biomethane plants and waste-to-energy facilities attempt alchemy. Rag pickers and informal recyclers, long criminalized, are rebranded as circular economy partners when a consultant writes the same truth in better fonts. Heat action plans map neighborhoods, deploy misting stations, stagger work hours, and print the most important adaptation tech of all. Instructions in simple words on when to rest, drink, and check on elders. Cross-border city networks. Mayors comparing notes on drains and drains of budgets are an underreported diplomacy that sidesteps national grandstanding. Universities and startups build low-cost sensors, map hotspots, and shame ministries into publishing data. Meanwhile, the great equalizer remains the monsoon. When drains choke and buses float, elites discover that climate is not a slum problem. The partition generation built dams and steel plants. Their grandchildren must build shade, trust, and breathable commutes. That requires laws and money, yes, but also a mental pivot to treat a tree-lined sidewalk, a well-ventilated classroom, a clean stove, and a migrant's rental as national assets. Climate, like partition, tests the idea of we. If we can mean across a border when a river swells, it can also mean across a street when a heat wave arrives. In that broader pronoun lies the only modernity worth having, one that counts its GDP in kilowatts of clean power, in liters of unpoisoned water, and the number of afternoons a child can play outside and come home tired from games rather than from breathing. Law's long shadow, treaties, property, and the quest for just procedures. The partition did not end in August 1947, entered the bloodstream of law. Courts and ministries inherited a century-long homework assignment to translate catastrophe into procedures that would not re-traumatize those already wounded. The first decades produced ad hoc innovations. custodian offices for evacuee property, claims tribunals, and compensation bonds, each attempting to square a ledger no moral arithmetic could balance. A shop in Amritsar never truly equals a shop in Lahore, because place is not fungible. Yet governance must pretend that it is, or else it cannot govern. Over time, these improvisations hardened into doctrines. The Liaquat, Nehru Pact, 1950, and subsequent agreements promised minority protections, repatriation channels, and mechanisms to restore or compensate for seized assets. Decades later, the language of restoration, allotment, and verification still echoes in case law and committee minutes, resurfacing whenever a family turns up with a yellowing deed, whenever a shrine seeks trusteeship across a border, whenever a cemetery's stones demand the dignity of maintenance. Legalism is double-edged. On one side, it universalizes. A widow with a properly witnessed affidavit can oblige a distant bureaucracy to recognize a loss it would rather forget. A nondescript file can compel a powerful office to yield. On the other side, it can become a thicket where the poor snag their clothes. Typos render identities doubtful. Deadlines close just as floods wash away documents. Cut-off dates convert trauma's irregular tempo into a bureaucratic calendar that punishes lateness born of poverty. The most honest reformers therefore treat procedure as both shield and scalpel, tight enough to stop fraud, soft enough to admit compassion. Contemporary debates over citizenship registers, refugee protocols, cross-border visas for patients and pilgrims, and the rights of abandoned women and children repeat old dilemmas with new jargon. Meanwhile, international law murmurs at the edges. Water treaties must survive wars. Prisoner exchanges require assurances that transcend daily outrage. Trade facilitation agreements must teach customs officers to prefer predictability over petty sovereignty. The best legal work here is unromantic. Digitizing land records without erasing oral titles. Enabling notarization at scale without creating new rent-seeking. Designing amnesties for paperwork irregularities that err on the side of inclusion. In this register, Partition's true legal legacy is not any single statute, but a civic temperament. The belief that a decent state can be built from forms and stamps only if those forms and stamps are continually audited by ethics, empathy, and the awareness that behind each file is a family that crosses a threshold with hope and fear in equal measure. Story versus silo. Textbooks, museums, and the new archives of the ordinary. How a nation remembers partition is also how it teaches itself to argue without hatred. For years, school books tended to flatten complexity. One country's texts cast the other as antagonist, reducing leaders to caricatures and negotiations to morality plays. Gradually, alternative pedagogies crept in. Teachers coaxed students to read memoir excerpts alongside treaties, to plot grandparents' journeys on maps, to compare newspaper front pages from August 1947. Museums and memory projects, some state-sponsored, many civic collected letters, utensils, train tickets, wedding invitations with dates that became impossible, and photographs where the background street is now across a border. These archives of the ordinary speak in a register official reports cannot reach. A spice tin with a city's name smudged by decades of kitchen heat. A school prize with a headmaster's signature who later died on a road crowded with people trying to live. The digital era multiplied such memory work. Oral history initiatives in Delhi, Lahore, Dhaka, Kolkata, and diaspora cities train volunteers to record elders in living rooms. University labs built searchable repositories tagged by district, dialect, and theme. Social media feeds turned anniversaries into temporary commons where competing narratives sometimes fought, but just as often listened. Filmmakers, playwrights, and novelists expanded the public's emotional vocabulary. A film might follow a refugee clerk rather than a prime minister. A play might stage a neighborhood committee debating whether to hide a neighbor. A novel might inhabit the mind of a railway guard deciding whether to wave a flag as a train approaches with rumors running ahead of it like wolves. Art does not replace history. It makes citizens feel their way back to facts. The challenge is curation without coercion. A museum that fetishizes gore becomes a factory of resentment. A textbook that erases atrocity becomes an accomplice to forgetting. The sweet spot is rigorous pluralism. Exhibits that juxtapose competing newspapers. Classrooms that debate primary sources. Syllabi that redmanto next to administrative correspondence. Ambedkar next to village registers. Fouiz next to relief camp minutes. When memory is thus disciplined, it becomes a civic muscle rather than a political cudgel. And when a teenager learns to interview an elder about 1947 with respect for both pain and context, the nation quietly rehearses a more difficult art, listening across difference, letting facts and feelings coexist until a usable truth emerges, not as commandment, but as conversation. The partition generation's grandchildren, technology, work, and a transnational commons. There is a practical continuity between a refugee's ration card and a smartphone wallet. Both are technologies for survival. The partition's grandchildren now live in a transnational commons stitched by fiber optics and low-cost flights. Startups pitch cross-border logistics that treat borders as parameters to code against, not walls to despair over. Remote work collapses distance. A developer in Lahore contracts with a firm in Bengaluru. A product manager in Dhaka coordinates with a designer in Delhi. A historian in Toronto builds a digital map of family routes annotated by QR-linked voice notes. None of this erases political tension. Visa regimes can still freeze opportunity, but it does normalize collaboration as a default, even when governments quarrel. Diaspora capital, financial and social, compounds the effect. Alum networks fund scholarships that send Pakistani and Indian students to the same graduate programs, where they discover that their grandparents' arguments can be discussed without reproducing them. Medical associations run telemedicine camps during floods and heat waves on either side of the line. Book festivals invite writers who could not otherwise share a stage. Meanwhile, civic tech experiments attack precisely the pathologies partition bequeathed. Apps to track missing persons reunited during annual fairs. Property digitization that preserves scanned deeds side by side with sworn neighbor testimonies. Open data dashboards that show district-level hate crime trends without sensationalism. Enabling early warning rather than late lament. Youth culture metabolizes the past in memes and mashups. A ghazal sampled over a hip-hop beat becomes a peace anthem on TikTok. A YouTube series reconstructs recipes that traveled with caravans, turning kitchens into ambulatory archives. Yet, digitization can also sharpen edges. Rumors sprint faster. Deepfakes wound reputations, and disinformation campaigns turn historical hurt into contemporary weapon. The answer is not nostalgia for pre-digital innocence, but literacy. Teaching verification as a civic right, platform design that slows virality for high-stakes content, and cross-border fact-checking consortiums that treat truth as shared infrastructure. Work, too, is becoming border-agnostic in niche ways. Game studios assemble teams from Dhaka to Delhi to Karachi. Fintech firms build rails for remittances that recognize kinship patterns better than banks did. Climate startups share monsoon models as common goods because the atmosphere cannot be paywalled. In this emerging commons, partition is neither forgotten nor fetishized. It is a caution painted on the underside of ambition. Build fast, but not on a fault line. Grow trade, but also trust. Code platforms that make neighbors legible to each other as humans first, demographics second. The grandchildren's task, then, is not to forgive or to indict, but to design institutions, tools, and habits that lower the cost of cooperation and raise the cost of cruelty. What partition teaches: state capacity, plural citizenship, and the price of speed. Looking back across 2 hours of narrative, a set of themes insists on being named. First, state capacity matters, not as an abstraction, but as trains that arrive on time, police who protect before they punish, courts that decide before lives are ruined by delay, and welfare systems that work without humiliating the applicant. In 1947, capacity was born mid-stride. Where it stumbled, violence sprinted ahead. Second, plural citizenship is not self-executing. Constitutions can promise equality, but equality lives or dies in school admissions, hospital triage, police stops, and the texture of daily speech. Any nationalism that measures itself primarily by exclusion eventually discovers that it has exiled part of its own future. Third, speed is a god with a price. Mountbatten's timetable may have preempted some mischief, but also guaranteed that mapping would outrun mediation. The Radcliffe Line's clarity at scale produced chaos in streets and fields. In the decades since, we relearn this lesson whenever hurried policy turns poor households into paperwork suspects, whenever slum demolition creates neat maps and messy lives, whenever social media accelerates outrage beyond a community's capacity to absorb it. Fourth, development without dignity is brittle. The Green Revolution's bounty held because it was institutionalized into procurement and school meals. Growth spurts that ignore fairness become grievances that someone, someday, will weaponize. Fifth, borders are not only fences, they are institutions. The Indus Waters Treaty endures because it is a machine of meetings, data, and procedure. Cross-border hots succeed because they are carefully designed exceptions that feed trust. Sixth, memory is governance. A nation that misremembers its fractures will reenact them. A nation that cures its grief with honesty can metabolize hurt into caution instead of panic. Finally, humility is policy. Rivers, heat, and pandemics do not care for flags. The only sovereignty that matters to a monsoon is the sovereignty of competent, coordinated response. If there is one synthesis worth engraving, it is this. Partition warns against purity, ethnic, religious, ideological, and argues for institutions that can hold disagreement without breaking. The test for our era is not whether we can win arguments about 1947. It is whether we can use what 1947 teaches to prevent 2047 from writing a new tragedy in the same hand. 10 practical bridges, a civic blueprint the region could build tomorrow. Grand sentiments are not enough. Bridges must be poured in concrete and code. 1. Water commons. Expand basin-level data exchange beyond treaties. Publish real-time river gauges and reservoir levels in open formats so farmers and city engineers on both sides can plan without rumor. 2. Health corridors. Institutionalize medical visas with 72-hour fast tracks and shared specialist rosters. When a child needs surgery, geopolitics should step aside. 3. Study exchanges. Create a South Asian semester where university students cross borders for 16 weeks via pooled scholarships. Treat it like an Erasmus for the subcontinent. 4. Trade small then big. Multiply border hots and digitize their ledgers. When tomatoes and textiles move easily, confidence grows to tackle bigger tariff disputes. 5. Women's Safety Compact. Cross-border hotline protocols for trafficking and abduction cases, standardized survivor-centered procedures, and guaranteed legal aid that follows the person, not the passport. 6. Memory labs. Fund joint archival projects to digitize district records, cemeteries, and newspapers from 1930 to 1955. Let machine-readable history defuse conspiracy by making facts searchable. 7. Climate alliances. Build a monsoon task force that shares models, coordinates heat action plans, and runs joint disaster drills. Invite cities before ministries, because cities are where adaptation happens. 8. Skills Rail. Mutual recognition of vocational certificates, welding, nursing, coding, so that workers can move legally for short stints, send remittances, and return with experience instead of stigma. 9. Justice APIs. Standardized cross-border judicial requests in child custody, inheritance, and property disputes with timelines, templates, and online status. When families break, they should not also break under procedure. 10. Culture and Commons. A shared OTT shelf each year. Curated films, dramas, documentaries from each country simultaneously streamed with subtitles, so ordinary viewers can see each other beyond punditry. None of these require dissolving borders. They require disciplined cooperation. They convert goodwill into routines and make peace less a summit and more a subscription, renewed automatically, canceled only with effort, and missed immediately when absent. Build even half, and partition's most corrosive inheritance, mutual illiteracy, will begin to fade. Epilogue, a lantern for the road ahead. Imagine, finally, a night train. The carriages are full of conversations in many tongues. Berths hold school children, salesmen, a grandmother with a steel tiffin whose dull taste of a city now across a border, a young coder debugging on a laptop, a nurse returning from a long shift, a poet with a notebook. Outside the window, fields breathe in darkness. A river flashes like a blade where floodlights touch it. A distant station holds a memorial plaque to a year when people ran not to catch trains, but to outrun them. This is the South Asia partition made possible by surviving it. Anxious, argumentative, inventive, and stubbornly alive. The line on the map is still there. You can feel it in visa forms and fearful jokes, in school debates and news anchors' decibels. But so are 1,000 bridges, many unofficial. Kitchens rehabilitate recipes. WhatsApp groups mobilize blood donors. Librarians in small towns catalog family albums. A village council decides, without drama, to share a tube well across a fence because drought does not carry ID. The work of the next century is not to abolish the border, nor to worship it, but to domesticate it, to teach it to serve livelihoods, learning, and safety. That work will be done by professionals and by neighbors, by courts and by kite flyers, by coders and by folk singers, by city engineers and by farmers who still read the sky better than satellites do. The partition story you have just heard is not a lament. It is an instruction manual written in elegy and blueprint. Keep it where emergency manuals are kept. Near the door, within reach when sirens sound, but also near the kitchen, where families make plans with calendars and shopping lists. When a rumor arrives faster than fact, slow it down. When a policy arrives faster than people can adapt, soften it. When a chance to cooperate appears, ritualize it into habit. If the subcontinent can learn to treat dignity as infrastructure, to budget for it, measure it, and maintain it, then 1947 will remain what it should be, a warning, a wound, and a well of stories we visit for wisdom. not an abyss we fall into again. And that night train will keep moving, halting, reversing, accelerating, carrying us toward a morning where borders exist, history is remembered, and neighbors recognize one another not as threats or saviors, but as partners in the long, ordinary heroism of making a home. What do we learn tonight? That a border is more than a fence. It's an institution that must be taught to serve people. That paperwork can wound or heal depending on who holds the stamp. That women rebuilt what violence tried to erase. That refuges become neighborhoods, camps become cities, and ration cards can evolve into passports for dignity. That treaties on rivers can outlast wars when they're built on rules, data, and patience. That glory without fairness is brittle, and speed without empathy is expensive. And that memory is not a weapon, it's a guide. From British withdrawal to the Radcliffe Award, from ghost trains to green fields of new harvests, from 1965 and 1971 to the nuclear shadow in Cargill, from slums that became engines of growth to deltas that keep teaching humility, we've traced a century's worth of choices. The moral of the story is simple and hard. Build capacity before crisis. Protect equality every day, not just in speeches, and ritualize cooperation so that peace doesn't depend on mood. Treat dignity like infrastructure. Budget for it. Maintain it. If this journey moved you, don't let it be the last stop. Subscribe, share, and come back to History Teller YT. Next, we'll dig into the micro stories, women's recovery missions across the border, the secret life of evacuee property ledgers, and the river engineers who keep two countries' taps running. In the comments, tell me the part of your family's story you think the world should hear, because the archive of the future is being built right now by you. Until then, keep your maps open and your heart larger than any line. Good night, and see you on the next train.